She had been sorting his medications for 2 years, showing up every Tuesday, every Thursday, every Saturday, while her brother managed the money. What she found in the wrong drawer one afternoon changed everything about what she thought she knew. My name is Anna Patton. I am 36 years old. And for 2 years before my father died, I was the one who showed up every Tuesday, every Thursday, every Saturday, while my brother managed the finances. What I found in a drawer I opened by mistake told me everything about what that arrangement had actually cost. My father was not a man who made announcements. He did not tell people what he was building. He simply built it quietly across 36 years in an account nobody in our family knew existed. My brother had access to the finances. He had been accessing them for 14 months. My father knew. He had been documenting every transfer from his desk on Thursday afternoons while I sorted his medications at the same table. He had a lawyer. He had instructions. He had been waiting for the right moment. The right moment was after he was gone. I had been getting around to things for 2 years. The lawyer's name was Mr. Osai. I had never met him. My father had never mentioned him to me directly, not because he was hiding anything, I understood later, but because my father communicated important things in the particular way of men of his generation who had learned that the most significant decisions were best made quietly and without announcement, carried out carefully, and then simply done. "Miss Patton," he said. His voice was measured and warm, the voice of a man who made difficult calls often and had learned to make them with care. "I represent your father's estate. I was sorry to hear of his passing. I wonder if you might be able to come to my office this morning." I looked at the clock, 7:44 now. This morning. "If possible," he said. "There are some matters your father asked me to discuss with you directly. I think you will want to hear them in person." I said yes. I put the phone down. I looked at the cold coffee and the gray window and the kitchen that smelled of the soup I had made 2 nights ago. The last thing my father had eaten, 3 spoonfuls before he said that's enough. Love, thank you in the voice he used when he meant it. And I understood, without knowing any of the details yet, that the next few hours were going to change the shape of something. He had been building something for 36 years, and he had built it entirely around the person who showed up on Tuesdays. Stay with me, because what Mr. Ose told me that morning was more than I had words for. And what my brother's face did when he heard it, I have never forgotten. For 2 years before my father died, I was the one who showed up. Not dramatically, not with sacrifice speeches or martyrdom or any of the performance that might have made it easier to explain to people later. I showed up the way you show up for someone you love, because it was Tuesday, because he needed his medication sorted, because the radiator needed someone to call about it even if the calling took 3 weeks, and the fixing never came, because he liked company in the evenings, and the evenings were long, and the house was quiet in a way that had changed entirely when my mother left it. I drove to his house on Tuesdays and Thursdays without exception. I came on Saturday mornings, and we ate toast and listened to the radio, and he told me things about his life that he had never told me when I was young and had no patience for the slow unfolding of a person's history. I learned that he had wanted to be an architect, that he had proposed to my mother twice before she said yes, that he kept, in the drawer of his bedside table, a photograph of himself at 22, standing in front of a car he had saved for 2 years to buy and sold 6 months later to cover a debt he never told anyone about. He showed me the photograph one Thursday evening in January. He held it for a long time before he put it back. "You were handsome," I told him. "I was broke," he said, and smiled. Those evenings were the gift I did not know I was receiving while I was receiving it. The particular gift of a person's full attention when they know their time is limited and have decided to stop saving things for later. He told me everything in those 2 years. Not all of it made sense at the time. Some of it I am still turning over. He never once told me about Mr. Osai. My brother's name is Callum. He is 4 years older than me and has lived, for the past decade, at a comfortable distance from anything requiring sustained effort. He visited our father on occasions, birthdays, Christmas, the specific holidays that could be photographed and posted with captions about family that his followers responded to warmly. He called on Sundays, sometimes. He had strong opinions about our father's care that he expressed clearly and acted on rarely. What he did consistently, for 2 years, was manage the finances. This had been his suggestion, offered early and accepted by our father in the way our father accepted things from Callum, with a kind of tired trust that I had watched for 30 years and never entirely understood. Callum was persuasive. He spoke with the particular confidence of a man who had learned that confidence, performed consistently, was often mistaken for competence. He set up access to the accounts. He handled the bills. When I asked, occasionally, how things were going financially, Callum said fine. Don't worry about it, in the tone that meant the conversation was finished. My father, when I raised it with him, said your brother has it sorted with the same tired trust. I did not push. I had enough to manage with the Tuesdays and Thursdays, and the Saturdays and the medication, and the radiator and the soup. I understand now that this is exactly what Callum was counting on. The first time I understood that something was wrong, I was in my father's kitchen looking for his blood pressure medication, and I opened the wrong drawer. Inside was a bank statement, not the account I knew about, the household account Callum managed, but a different one. A savings account, in my father's name alone, with a balance I had not expected, and a withdrawal history that told a story I was not ready for. I closed the drawer. I stood in the kitchen for a long moment. Then I opened it again, and I took the statement, and I folded it, and I put it in my bag. And I said nothing to anyone for 6 weeks, not because I was afraid, but because I needed to understand the full shape of it before I made a single move. My father had taught me that, quietly, over soup on Thursday evenings. Don't reach for a thing, he told me once, until you know exactly what you're reaching for. I did not know it then, but he had been preparing me for this specific moment for longer than I had realized. There were things he had put in place, carefully, quietly, without announcement, that I would not discover until I sat across from Mr. Osai in his office on a Tuesday morning with cold coffee still sitting on my kitchen table at home. Things that Callum did not know existed. Things that changed everything. But before I tell you what Mr. Osai told me that morning, before I tell you what my father had built in silence while Callum was managing the account he knew about, I need to take you back to the beginning. To the Tuesday 2 years ago when I first walked into my father's house and understood, without being told, that the seasons had shifted and something was being asked of me. Because that Tuesday is where this story actually starts. And because you need to know who my father was before you can understand what he did. Before I go further, if you are watching this and there is someone in your life you show up for quietly, without announcement, without anyone particularly noticing, leave me a comment and tell me where you are watching from. I read every single one. And I need you with me for what comes next, because the part about Mr. Osai's office, I have not told this to anyone in full until right now. The first Tuesday I drove to my father's house with intention rather than habit. The maple in his front yard had just begun to turn. Not fully, only at the tips of the highest branches, a blush of orange at the very top where the season arrives first, the tree changing from the crown down the way old men go gray, gradually, and from the outside in. I sat in the car for a moment after I parked, looking at it. My father had planted that maple the year he and my mother moved in. It was now 34 years old and taller than the house, and in the right light, which was the light of an early September afternoon, it was one of the most beautiful things on the street. He was standing at the kitchen window when I came up the walk, watching for me. He did not wave, he simply stood there, and when I looked up and met his eyes through the glass, he turned away, back to whatever he had been doing, as though he had not been watching at all, as though he simply happened to be at the window. He had been doing that my entire life, standing at windows, watching for people he loved, and then pretending he hadn't been. My mother used to say it was the most romantic thing about him. I had come to understand it as the primary language of a man who found direct expressions of need almost physically impossible, but who needed people deeply and constantly, and showed it in the only ways available to him: by watching for them, by having the kettle on when they arrived, by remembering small things they had mentioned weeks before and acting on them without comment. I let myself in with the key I had carried since university. The house smelled the same as it had always smelled: old wood and the particular mustiness of books kept in warm rooms, and underneath everything, faintly, the lavender my mother had kept in a bowl on the hallway table, and that my father still replaced, quietly and without mentioning it, from the garden every summer. The bowl was there. The lavender was there. My mother had been gone for 4 years, and the lavender was still there. He was at the stove when I came into the kitchen, his back to me, stirring something he claimed was soup, but which I recognized as the particular pale broth he made when he was not feeling well and wanted something that required no chewing and no explanation. "You didn't have to come," he said, without turning around. "I know," I said. I sat down at the kitchen table, the one with the burn mark on the left corner from a candle that had gone over at a Christmas dinner in 1997, and that nobody had ever done anything about. He brought 2 bowls to the table and sat across from me, and we ate without much conversation, the radio doing the work of filling the silence the way it always had in this kitchen. Halfway through the bowl, he set his spoon down and looked at me with the direct, assessing look he used when he was about to say something he had been organizing for a while. "My hip is worse," he said. "I know," I said again. "The stairs are becoming," he stopped, searched for a word that was not the word he was avoiding. "Inconvenient." "I'll come Tuesdays and Thursdays," I said, "and Saturdays." He picked up his spoon. He stirred the broth once. "You have your own life," he said. It was not a protest. It was a fact he was presenting for acknowledgement before accepting help, his specific, particular way of asking without asking. "I do," I said, "and Tuesdays and Thursdays and Saturdays are part of it." He nodded once. He finished his soup. He did not thank me directly, because that was not how he was built, but when I left that evening he walked me to the door, which he had not done in months because the hallway was long and the hip made long distances costly, and he stood on the porch in the September evening without his jacket and watched me get in the car. And as I pulled away, I looked in the rearview mirror and he was still standing there, one hand raised, watching until I turned the corner. That was his thank you. That was how I knew. I drove home that evening understanding that something had shifted, that the seasons of my relationship with my father had moved into a new configuration, one that would ask more of me than the previous ones and give more back in equal measure, and that I had chosen it with my whole heart and intended to keep choosing it. I did not know then how long it would last. I did not know about the Tuesdays with the photograph in the bedside drawer, or the Thursdays with the radio, or the specific quality of the last 6 months when the talking became the primary activity of our time together, because everything else had become too difficult. I only knew that I was going to show up. So I showed up. The Tuesday and Thursday visits settled into their own rhythm within a month, the way new routines do when they are built around genuine need rather than obligation. I arrived at 10 in the morning. I sorted the medications first. My father's prescription management had become, over the previous year, a complex architecture of pill boxes and refill schedules that Callum had set up in theory and allowed to drift in practice. I rebuilt the system from scratch on the first Tuesday, creating a spreadsheet on my phone that tracked each medication, its dosage, its refill date, and the specific pharmacy that stocked the less common one, which was not the nearest pharmacy, but the one 40 minutes away that my father had always used and refused to change. After medications came the practical things. The grocery run on Tuesdays, the specific list my father approved each week with the quiet authority of a man who had strong feelings about brand loyalty and rightness, and which type of bread was acceptable and which was not. The bills on Thursdays, which I reviewed with him at the kitchen table, going through each one while he followed along and asked questions that showed he was tracking everything precisely even as his body made other things harder. He was not a man who allowed confusion about his own finances. He understood every line. Or so I thought. What I did not know, what I would not know for another 18 months, was that the finances I was reviewing with him on those Thursday afternoons were not all of them. They were the surface layer, the household account, the utility bills, the pension deposits and the modest withdrawals that covered groceries and the pharmacy 40 minutes away. Underneath, that layer was something else entirely. My father had grown up without money in the particular way of people whose families had been without it for generations. Not dramatically poor, not the kind of poverty that announces itself, but the grinding, low-level scarcity that teaches you to be careful without teaching you to be comfortable. He had worked since he was 14. He had saved since the first paycheck, not large amounts but consistent ones, and he had invested with the particular conservatism of a man who did not trust markets. He did not understand, and so spent 40 years educating himself until he understood them. He never told anyone about this. Not my mother, or rather, he told my mother, but my mother kept his confidences the way she kept everything, which was absolutely and without exception. She had taken the knowledge with her when she went. My father had apparently decided, after she died, that it was time to make some arrangements. He made them quietly, over 18 months, while I was sorting his medications and driving 40 minutes for the right pharmacy and reviewing utility bills at the kitchen table on Thursday afternoons. While Callum was managing the account he had been given access to and assuming it was the whole picture. It was not the whole picture. But I am getting ahead of myself. What I want to tell you about first is Callum. Because you need to understand Callum before you can understand what my father was watching for from those kitchen windows across all those years. My brother arrived at my father's house on the second Sunday of every month with the reliability of a scheduled appointment, which is essentially what it was. He came at noon. He stayed for 2 hours, occasionally 3 if there was something he wanted to discuss. He brought food sometimes, good food, the expensive kind, things my father appreciated but would never have purchased for himself. He set it on the counter with the ease of a man delivering a gift he knows will be received well, and my father received it well. And Callum noted this satisfaction with the quiet pleasure of a person who has learned that generosity, strategically applied, earns a specific kind of goodwill. I watched this for 2 years from a careful distance. What Callum gave was visible and comfortable. What I gave was invisible and necessary. The medication schedules, the pharmacy runs, the Thursday bills, the Tuesday soups, the specific listening that my father needed in those last months when the thing he most required was someone who would sit with him without needing him to perform wellness he did not have. Callum was not cruel. I want to be precise about that. He was not a villain in the way of stories that have clear villains. He was a man who had made an accurate calculation about effort and reward and had organized his life accordingly, giving what was visible and noticed, managing what gave him access, and trusting that the rest would be handled by someone else. The someone else was me. He never said thank you for this. I do not think it occurred to him that thanks were required for something he had not asked to be done. The finances were his from the beginning. He had proposed it at the first family meeting after my mother died, a brief, practical conversation at my father's kitchen table, the 3 of us, the burn mark on the corner between Callum's elbow and my coffee cup. Dad shouldn't have to worry about bills and accounts on top of everything else, Callum had said. Reasonable, caring sounding. My father had agreed with the relieved trust of a man who had just buried his wife and was grateful to have one less thing to hold. I had agreed too. I want to be honest about that. It had seemed sensible. Callum was organized, or appeared to be. I had the Tuesdays and Thursdays and Saturdays. Dividing the responsibilities had seemed, at the time, like the obvious solution. The first sign that something was wrong was not the bank statement in the wrong drawer. That came later. The first sign was smaller. A conversation with my father on a Thursday afternoon in the spring of the second year, when he mentioned, in the distracted, peripheral way he mentioned things he was uncertain about, that he had asked Callum about a savings bond that matured in March and Callum had said it had been reinvested. Reinvested where? I asked. My father looked at the table. He said not to worry about it. Did he show you the paperwork? A pause that lasted longer than it should have. He said he'd bring it next time. Next time had been 6 weeks ago. The paperwork had not appeared. I had noted this and filed it and kept showing up on Tuesdays and Thursdays, and I had not said anything to Callum because I did not yet have enough to say anything with. 3 weeks after that conversation, I opened the wrong drawer looking for my father's blood pressure medication and found the bank statement. The account it described was in my father's name alone. The balance was substantial, more than substantial, the kind of number that recontextualizes everything you thought you understood about a person's financial situation. The withdrawal history went back 14 months. Regular transfers, consistent amounts, all to an account whose last 4 digits I did not recognize. I stood in that kitchen for a long time. My father was in the living room. I could hear the radio, the afternoon program he liked, the one with the music from the 40s that he always said reminded him of his own father's house, and that I had come to associate entirely with him, with these rooms, with the smell of lavender in the hallway. I folded the statement. I put it in my bag. I went to the living room doorway. My father was in his chair, eyes half closed, his hands folded in his lap in the way they rested now when he was not doing anything, slightly curled, slightly still, the hands of a man who had used them hard for 70 years and was allowing them, finally, to rest. He looked peaceful. He looked, in that afternoon light, exactly like the person I had been showing up for, the man at the window, the lavender in the bowl, the soup that required no explanation. I did not say anything about the statement. Same time Thursday, I said. He opened his eyes. He looked at me with the direct, warm look he had given me my entire life, the look that meant he saw me clearly and was glad of what he saw. Same time Thursday, he said. I drove home with the bank statement in my bag and 6 weeks of careful, quiet investigation ahead of me, and the growing understanding that my father, the man at the window, the man who never reached for a thing until he knew exactly what he was reaching for, had been watching something develop for a long time and had made arrangements accordingly. I just did not yet know the shape of those arrangements. Mr. Osai's call was still 8 months away. But my father had been preparing for it since long before I found that statement. Since long, I would discover, before I even began showing up on Tuesdays. If you have ever shown up for someone quietly, without anyone keeping score, without anyone particularly noticing, I want to hear from you. Leave a comment. Tell me one Tuesday you showed up for someone who needed you. I read every single one. My father had put that statement in the wrong drawer on purpose. He had been watching to see if I would look. And he had known, for longer than I had realized, exactly what Callum was doing with the account he could see. What I did not know yet was how far back the watching went, how long he had been building something nobody in our family knew existed. Stay with me. I gave myself 6 weeks. Not because 6 weeks was the right amount of time. I did not know what the right amount of time was. I gave myself 6 weeks because that was how long I thought I could hold what I knew without either saying something I wasn't ready to say or becoming someone I didn't recognize in the holding of it. 6 weeks to understand the full shape before I made a single move. My father's instruction, applied to his own situation. I started on a Tuesday evening, sitting at my kitchen table with the bank statement unfolded in front of me and my laptop open beside it. The account was straightforward to find once I knew it existed. It was registered to my father alone. His name, his address, the same branch he had used for 40 years. The statement I had found covered 3 months. The balance at the top was large enough that I sat with it for several minutes before I moved on to the withdrawal history. 14 entries across 12 weeks, all transfers, all to the same destination account, the last 4 digits the same each time, regular as a subscription, the amounts varying slightly but falling within a consistent range. Not small amounts. Not dramatic ones either, nothing that would alarm a casual observer. The kind of withdrawals that looked, if you were not paying attention, like ordinary household expenses for a man living alone. I had been paying attention for 2 years. These were not household expenses. The destination account took longer. I could not access it directly. It was not in my father's name, or if it was, I had no way of confirming it from the statement alone. What I could do was cross-reference the amounts against the household account records I had been reviewing with my father on Thursday afternoons. The account Callum managed, the one I had assumed was the complete picture. I pulled up my own notes from the previous year. Every Thursday I had kept a simple log, date, bills reviewed, amounts, anything requiring follow-up. 18 months of Thursdays in a document on my phone, methodical and dry, the administrative record of 2 years of showing up. I worked through it carefully. The household account showed the expected expenses, utilities, groceries, the pharmacy, the occasional larger purchase. What it did not show was any record of the savings bond Callum had said was reinvested in March. The bond had matured. I could see its final interest payment in the statement from the account I had found. After that payment, nothing. The principal had moved somewhere, not back into this account, somewhere else. I wrote this down. Then I went further back. The more I looked, the clearer the shape became, not all at once, but the way shapes emerge in low light, gradually and then with sudden certainty. Small transfers in the early months, larger ones as the year progressed. A pattern of access that had begun cautiously and grown more confident over time, the way things grow more confident when they meet no resistance. Callum had been meeting no resistance. Because I had been doing the Tuesdays and the Thursdays and the Saturdays, and Callum had been doing the finances, and my father had been trusting his son with the account his son knew about. The account his son knew about. I want to tell you something about my father that matters here. Gerald Patton was not a naive man. He was not an old man who had been confused by paperwork or manipulated by someone more financially sophisticated than himself. He had managed money carefully for 50 years. He understood compound interest and asset allocation, and the difference between a transfer and a withdrawal in ways that most people never bother to learn. The man who had sat with me on Thursday afternoons, reviewing utility bills with focused attention, was the same man who had built something significant in quiet over decades. He had known. I became certain of this on a Thursday in the 4th week of my investigation, sitting across from him at the kitchen table in the afternoon light, reviewing the gas bill. He was following along with his usual precision, asking the right questions, nodding at the right moments. And then, without transition, without any change in his tone, he said, "You found the statement." I looked up at him. He was looking at the gas bill. He did not look at me. "The one in the wrong drawer," he said. I set my pen down. "Yes," I said. He nodded, still looking at the bill. "I put it there on purpose," he said. "I wasn't sure you'd look, but I thought you might." The kitchen was very quiet. The radio was off. We had turned it off to review the bill, and I had not turned it back on. Outside the window, the maple had gone full red by now, the tips and the trunk and everything between, the entire tree committed to the season. "How long have you known?" I asked. "Long enough," he said. "Since the bond, maybe before that. I am not," he paused. "I am not as easy to manage as he believes." Something shifted in my chest. Something that was relief and grief at the same time, the two arriving together the way they often do when a thing you feared turns out to be true, but the person at the center of it turns out to be clearer-eyed than you had allowed yourself to hope. "Dad." "I made arrangements," he said. He looked at me then directly, the assessing look he used for things that mattered. "A long time ago, before your mother died. Updated them after. Mr. Osai has everything." "Who is Mr. Osai?" A small smile. The particular smile he used when he had been waiting for a question. "My lawyer," he said. "He'll call you when the time comes." He picked up the gas bill. He pointed to a line item. "This seems high for October," he said. "Can you check the previous year?" And that was the conversation. He moved back to the gas bill, and I checked the previous year, and the conversation was finished. Not avoided, not deflected, simply complete in the way my father's conversations were always complete when he had said the thing he needed to say and moved on to the next thing. He had been managing this for longer than I had known. He had put things in place. Mr. Osai had everything. I drove home that evening in the dark, and the maple in his yard caught my headlights as I pulled out, and in the light it was the color of a lit window in a dark street, warm and specific and briefly, vividly there. I did not sleep much that night either. The final 6 months arrived with the particular quality of time that moves slowly and quickly in equal measure, each day long and specific, each week gone before I properly registered it. My father's hip worsened steadily. The stairs became first difficult and then impossible, and we moved his sleeping arrangements to the ground floor room that had been his study, the one with the window that faced the garden and the desk where he had kept his papers for 34 years. I came every day by December. Not for any single task, the tasks were manageable still, but because the rhythm of the daily visit had become something he needed and something I needed in equal measure. And because the conversations had become the primary thing, the center of the visit rather than the frame around the practical work. He talked about his own father in those months, about growing up in a house where money was counted carefully and silence about money was a form of dignity, about the specific satisfaction of the first paycheck he had saved from rather than spent entirely, about the decision, made in his 30s with my mother at this same kitchen table, to build something quietly and keep it quiet, not from shame, but from the particular wisdom of people who understand that visible wealth invites a different quality of attention than invisible wealth. "Nobody asks you for what they don't know you have," he said once. He was looking out the window at the garden when he said it. The garden was bare by then, the beds covered for winter, the maple stripped to its branches. "Did Callum ever ask?" I said. "Callum asked about the accounts he could see," my father said. "He never asked about the ones he couldn't." He turned from the window. "You never asked either," he said. "You asked about me." I have turned that sentence over many times since. The distinction it contains, asking about accounts versus asking about a person, seems to me now the entire story in a single sentence. My father had been watching for the difference his entire life. He had found it in me not because I was particularly virtuous, but because I had simply been interested in him, in the photograph of the 22-year-old, in the twice-refused proposal, in the car sold to cover a debt. In the person, rather than the inventory. He had noticed. He had always been noticing. In January, he stopped being able to manage the stairs to the study too, and we moved everything to the bedroom on the ground floor, the one adjacent to the kitchen, where the radiator worked inconsistently, and I brought a small electric heater and set it in the corner. He slept more. He talked less but more deliberately, the way people talk when they are conserving energy and choosing what to spend it on carefully. On a Thursday afternoon in late January, he asked me to bring him the box on the top shelf of his wardrobe. It was a small wooden box, plain, with a brass clasp. I brought it to him, and he opened it and took out a brass key on a leather loop worn smooth, the leather dark with handling, the kind of object that had been carried and touched for many years. He put it in my hand. "Mr. Osai," he said, "when he calls, give him this. He knows what it opens." I closed my hand around the key. It was warm from the box, or from his hand before it, I could not tell which. "Dad," I said. I did not have the rest of the sentence. He did not need the rest of it. He patted my hand once, the way he had patted it my entire life, briefly, firmly, without lingering, because he was not a man who lingered on gestures but made them with complete attention and moved on. "Same time Thursday," he said. It was not Thursday, it was Tuesday. He was tired. "Same time Thursday," I said. He died on a Tuesday, 11 days later. The heater ticked in the corner. His hand was in mine. The last thing he said to me 2 days before, when he still had the energy for full sentences, was, "You showed up, Anna. That was the whole thing. You showed up." I have been trying to understand the full weight of those words ever since. Mr. Ose called 11 hours later, at 7:43 in the morning. I want to tell you what I did in those 11 hours between my father's death and the lawyer's call. Not all of it. Some of it belongs to me alone. The particular private grief of a person learning what the absence of someone specific feels like in real time, in a real house, at a real kitchen table. But some of it I will tell you, because what I did in those 11 hours tells you something about the shape of what was coming, and about the kind of daughter my father had made his plans around. I called the necessary people, the doctor, the funeral home, the cousin in Edinburgh who needed to know. I made these calls methodically, from the list my father and I had assembled together in December. He had insisted on the list, had sat with me at the kitchen table, and gone through every name and number with the precise, deliberate attention he brought to everything practical. And I had typed them into my phone while he dictated, and the radio played in the background. He had been ready. He had made sure I was ready, too. After the calls, I sat at the kitchen table with the cold coffee and the list and the brass key on its leather loop, which I had placed on the table in front of me because I needed something of his within sight. The house was very quiet. The radiator knocked once in the bedroom and then went silent. Outside, the January dark was going gradually gray, the sky lightening in the particular reluctant way of winter mornings that arrive late and leave early and offer only the most provisional version of daylight. I did not call Callum. I want to be honest about this. The decision was not vindictive, or not primarily vindictive, and I am trying to be accurate. I did not call Callum because my father had told me in December, with the directness he used for important things, that Mr. Osai would handle the notifications. That it was all arranged. That my job was to give Mr. Osai the key when he called, and to be in his office when he asked me to be, and to trust that what came next was what my father had intended. "I've been working on this for 3 years," my father had said, "since your mother died. It's done properly, Anna. Everything is in order." He had said it with the satisfaction of a man who has completed a long piece of careful work and knows it is sound. So I sat at the kitchen table with the cold coffee and the brass key, and I waited for 7:43 in the morning, which is when Mr. Osai called, and which is where this story began, and which is where, now that you know who my father was, and who I was to him, and who Callum was, and what the wrong drawer contained, we are finally ready to go. Because what Mr. Osai told me in his office that Tuesday morning, what my father had built over 3 years in careful, deliberate, absolute silence, was not what I expected, and I had, by then, adjusted my expectations considerably. It was still more than that. It was more than I had words for, sitting across from Mr. Osai in his chair with the brass key in my hand, and the winter light coming through the office window, and my father 11 hours gone. It was the full weight of a man who had been watching from windows his entire life, noticing everything, saying little, and building, quietly, patiently, with complete intention, toward the moment when the person he had been watching for would be ready to receive what he had saved for her. Not because she had asked, because she had shown up. Mr. Osai's office was on the 3rd floor of a building on Clement Street, the kind of building that had been there long enough to have developed a personality, dark wood paneling in the lobby, a lift that moved with deliberate slowness, the particular smell of old carpet and warm radiators that belongs to places where serious things have been handled for many years. I arrived at 8:55, 8 minutes early, which was how my father had always arrived for appointments, early enough to be ready, not so early as to be anxious. I had not planned it. My body had simply followed the habit he had built in me. The receptionist showed me to a chair outside a closed door. On the wall beside it hung a framed photograph of a harbor, gray water, small boats, the kind of image that had been chosen specifically to give people something calm to look at while they waited for things that were not calm. I looked at it for 8 minutes. Mr. Osai opened the door himself. He was a tall man in his 60s, unhurried in his movements, with the particular stillness of someone who had spent decades in rooms where people were frightened or grieving or both, and had learned to bring his own steadiness into those rooms as a professional offering. He shook my hand. He said he was sorry about my father. He said it simply and meant it. I could tell the difference. After 2 years of watching people perform condolences at my mother's funeral and my father's deterioration. "Come in," he said. "Sit down. Can I get you anything?" "No," I said. "Thank you." I sat across from his desk. It was a plain desk, large, organized, nothing unnecessary on its surface. A dark green folder in the center, a glass of water he had placed there before I arrived. A small framed photograph turned away from me, facing him, which I did not look at because it was private. I placed the brass key on the desk between us. Mr. Osai looked at it for a moment. Then he looked at me with an expression I could not immediately read, something between recognition and a careful, private sadness. "He told me you would bring that," he said. "He said you wouldn't need to be reminded." "He was right," I said. Mr. Osai nodded once. He picked up the key. He held it briefly, with the specific reverence of a man handling something that belongs to a person he respected, and then he set it beside the green folder and folded his hands on the desk. "Miss Patton," he said, "your father retained me 11 years ago." 11 years. Not 3 years, as my father had said in December. 11, before my mother died, before the hip, before the Tuesdays and Thursdays. 11 years ago, when my father had been 60 and healthy and had apparently decided that the time to make arrangements was not when arrangements became urgent but long before, when there was still time to make them well. I sat with that number for a moment. He updated his instructions several times. Mr. Osai continued. "The most recent update was 14 months ago." He paused, "after he gave your brother access to the household account." Something in my chest settled, not with relief exactly, but with the specific sensation of a thing that had been uncertain resolving into clarity. My father had known. He had known from the beginning what giving Callum access would produce, and he had gone to his lawyer 14 months ago and updated his instructions accordingly. He had not been deceived. He had been watching and making arrangements and waiting for Tuesday mornings when I would show up to sort the medications and review the bills and ask him about the photograph in the bedside drawer. "What are the instructions?" I said. Mr. Ose opened the green folder. What followed was 40 minutes that I have since replayed many times, not obsessively, not with any drama, but with the particular quality of attention you bring to something that continues to reveal new layers the more carefully you examine it. 40 minutes in which my father, through the measured voice of his lawyer, told me things I had not known and things I had suspected and things I could not have imagined in that order. The household account, the one Callum managed, the one I had reviewed on Thursday afternoons, held, at the time of my father's death, approximately £4,000. Callum had been transferring from it regularly for 14 months. The transfers were to an account in Callum's name at a different bank. Mr. Ose had a forensic accountant's summary in the folder. The total removed was £63,000 across the 14 months. He slid the summary across the desk. I looked at it. The numbers were clear: dates, amounts, destination account, all of it documented with the clean, irrefutable precision of financial records that do not care about context or intention or family feeling. £63,000. Gone. I set the summary back on the desk. My father knew about this, I said. He did, Mr. Osai said. He tracked it from the beginning. He provided me with copies of these records as they accumulated. He did not intervene because, he paused, choosing the next words carefully, because he had a different plan for what should happen to the information. What plan? Mr. Ose looked at me steadily. The plan required you to find the statement in the wrong drawer. The drawer he had put there on purpose. The statement I had found and folded and put in my bag and said nothing about for 6 weeks. The conversation at the kitchen table about the gas bill. I put it there on purpose. I wasn't sure you'd look, but I thought you might. He had been building a case. Quietly, methodically, over 14 months, while Tuesdays and Thursdays kept him company, and Callum managed the account he could see. He had been building a case the way he built everything, carefully, without announcement, in the particular silence of a man who does not reach for a thing until he knows exactly what he is reaching for. There is more, Mr. Osai said. He turned to the next section of the folder. This was the part I had not expected. Not the 63,000. I had arrived at that figure approximately on my own during the 6 weeks of investigation. What I had not arrived at, what I had not known to look for, was the second account. Not the household account Callum managed. Not the savings account whose statement I had found in the wrong drawer. A third account. My father had opened it in 1987, the year I was born. A simple investment account at a firm he had corresponded with for years. A careful, old-fashioned correspondence, letters and quarterly statements, the kind of relationship with a financial institution that had largely ceased to exist by the time I was old enough to understand what investments were. He had contributed to it consistently for 36 years. Not large amounts in the early years. He did not have large amounts in the early years, but consistently, without interruption, through the years when money was tight, and the years when it was less tight, and the years after my mother died when it would have been entirely reasonable to stop. He did not stop. The account had been in his sole name for 36 years. It appeared in no document Callum had ever seen. It was managed by a firm whose name appeared on no statement in the household files. It had been, for 36 years, entirely invisible to everyone in our family except my father and Mr. Osai. Mr. Ose slid a single page across the desk. I looked at the number at the bottom of the page. I looked at it for long enough that Mr. Osai, who was watching me with the careful attention of a man who had delivered this information several times and knew what the first moment of seeing it looked like, said quietly, "Take your time." I looked up at him. "Is this correct?" I said. "It is," he said. "This is." "Yes," he said, gently, "it is." I set the page down on the desk. I picked up the glass of water he had placed there before I arrived and I drank half of it. I set it down. I looked at the photograph of the harbor on the wall, the same one from outside, or a different one. I could not be certain, and I breathed. My father had been saving since 1987. 36 years of quiet, consistent, unannounced accumulation. The kind of building that is only possible when you are not telling anyone about it, when you are free from the particular erosion of other people's awareness of what you have, the way that awareness generates requests and expectations, and the gradual redistribution of resources toward whoever is most persistent about needing them. Nobody had known, so nobody had asked. And 36 years of nobody asking had allowed the account to become what it was. I thought about the conversation in December. Nobody asks you for what they don't know you have. He had not been describing a philosophy. He had been describing a practice. A 36-year practice, begun the year I was born, maintained through everything, updated 14 months ago to account for what Callum had been doing with the account he could see. He had seen it coming. He had been ready for it before it arrived. "What are his instructions?" I said. My voice was steady. I was grateful for that. Mr. Ose turned to the final section of the green folder. The instructions were precise and complete, written in the clear, specific language of a man who had spent 11 years refining them and did not want them misunderstood. Mr. Ose read them aloud, in his measured voice, in the quiet office on the 3rd floor of the building on Clement Street, while the winter light came through the window and lay across the desk in a pale rectangle that moved slowly across the floor as the morning progressed. I listened to every word. The estate was to be divided as follows. The household account, what remained of it after Callum's 14 months of transfers, was to be frozen immediately pending a civil recovery action, which Mr. Osei had already prepared. The £63,000 Callum had transferred was to be pursued through that action. My father had left Mr. Osei a signed statement confirming his awareness of the transfers and his instructions to pursue recovery after his death. He had also left copies of every bank record, every transfer confirmation, every piece of documentation that the forensic accountant had assembled. My father had assembled all of it himself, over 14 months. On Thursday afternoons, between the gas bill and the medication schedule, while I drove 40 minutes to the right pharmacy, and he sat at his desk in the study with the papers spread around him, building a case. He was thorough, Mr. Osei said, with the small, grim satisfaction of a professional acknowledging excellent work by a client. He was always thorough, I said. The house, 34 years of it, the maple in the front yard, the lavender in the hallway bowl, the burn mark on the kitchen table, was to pass to me entirely. No division, no conditions, mine. The investment account, the 36-year account, the one begun the year I was born, was to pass to me in full. There were specific bequests, a sum to a charity my mother had supported, a smaller sum to the cousin in Edinburgh, a donation to the church he had attended 3 times in his adult life and felt he had written in the instructions, a vague but persistent obligation toward. And a letter. A sealed letter, addressed to Callum, to be delivered by Mr. Osei's office by registered post on the morning of the will reading. "What does it say?" I asked. "I don't know," Mr. Osei said. "He wrote it himself and sealed it before he gave it to me, 3 years ago. He said Callum would understand it when he received it." I sat with that for a long time. My father, 3 years ago, sitting at his desk in the study, writing a letter to his son that he sealed and gave to his lawyer and never mentioned again. 3 years of knowing what was in that letter and keeping it in an office on Clement Street, waiting. The patience of the man. I thought about the maple in the front yard, 34 years old, taller than the house now. My father had planted it the year they moved in, before I was born, before Callum was born, before any of the particular shape of our family had been determined. He had planted it because he intended to stay, and because he understood that the things worth having required time and consistency, and the willingness to tend something long before it was large enough to notice. 34 years later, It was the most beautiful thing on the street. "When is the will reading?" I said. "Friday," Mr. Osai said. "I have notified your brother this morning." Something moved across his face when he said it, not quite a smile, too careful for that, but something. "How did he respond?" I asked. "He said he would be there," Mr. Osai said. He also asked at some length about the composition of the estate. "What did you tell him?" I told him the details would be discussed at the reading. I looked at the green folder on the desk, the summary page, the single page with the number I had looked at for a long time. "He doesn't know about the third account," I said. "No," Mr. Osai said, "he does not." I picked up the glass of water and finished it. I set it down carefully on the desk. Outside, the window Clement Street was doing its ordinary Tuesday morning business. People moving past with coats and bags, a delivery van double parked, a woman with a pushchair navigating the narrow pavement with the practiced patience of someone who does this every day. Ordinary, unremarkable, entirely itself. Inside the office on the third floor, the green folder sat on the plain desk, and the brass key sat beside it, and the winter light continued its slow movement across the floor, and I sat in the chair my father had chosen for me, metaphorically, deliberately, across 11 years of quiet preparation, and understood that Friday was going to be a very specific kind of morning. The kind my father had been building toward for a very long time. The kind that required a person who showed up on Tuesdays. I need to stop here for a moment. If you have ever watched someone underestimate a person, they should have paid closer attention to leave me a comment. Tell me what that looked like. My father had been preparing that Friday for 3 years. He had written the letter, sealed it, given it to his lawyer, and never mentioned it again. Callum was about to walk into a room that had been arranged around him for longer than he knew, and he had no idea. Stay with me. The days between Tuesday and Friday were 3 days long, and considerably longer than that. I spent the first of them in my father's house. Not purposefully, I had not planned to go. I drove there on Wednesday morning without making a decision to drive there, the way you sometimes find yourself somewhere your body needed to be before your mind caught up with the need. I parked in front of the Maple. I sat in the car for a moment looking at it. Then I let myself in with the key I had carried since university and stood in the hallway and breathed the smell of old wood and warm rooms and lavender. The bowl on the hallway table was still full. He had replaced the lavender in November, the last time he had been well enough to go to the garden. It would last another month, perhaps 2. After that, I would replace it myself, and after that I would replace it again, and I understood standing in that hallway that this was something I intended to do for as long as I lived in this house. I intended to live in this house. The understanding arrived without announcement, the way the most certain things arrive. I had my own flat 20 minutes away, rented, functional, the kind of place that serves its purpose without ever quite becoming a home. I had lived there for 6 years and never once planted anything in the window boxes or replaced the landlord's picture hooks with my own. I had always understood, without examining the understanding, that I was waiting for somewhere that was mine in a different sense. This house was mine in that sense now. My father had known it would be. He had been counting on it, in the specific way he counted on things, not wishfully, but as a considered assessment of a person's character and what that character would lead them toward. I walked through the rooms slowly, without a plan. The study first, the room where he had spent his last months, the desk still holding the arrangement of papers he had maintained until he could no longer manage the desk. I did not touch anything yet. I stood in the doorway and looked at the desk and the papers and the window facing the bare winter garden, and I let myself feel the full weight of his absence in that room. The specific, particular absence of a person whose presence had shaped a space so completely that the space still held the shape of them. The kitchen next, the burn mark on the table, the radio. the bowl of lavender visible through the hallway door. I put the kettle on because the kettle was what you put on in this kitchen when you needed a moment, and I stood at the window above the sink while it heated and looked at the garden and thought about nothing in particular, which was what the garden required. The bedroom last. The small electric heater still in the corner where I had placed it. The bedside table with its drawer, closed now, the photograph of the 22-year-old inside it, the car sold to cover a debt. I had not opened the drawer on a Tuesday morning expecting to find his blood pressure medication, and found instead a bank statement and the beginning of understanding. He had put that there on purpose. He had known I would open the wrong drawer because he had watched me for 36 years and understood that I was the kind of person who opened the wrong drawer, who went looking not for what was on the list, but for what was needed, who paid attention to the thing beside the thing, who showed up on Tuesdays when showing up was what was required. I sat on the edge of the bed. The heater ticked in the corner. The winter light came through the window in the low, flat way of January afternoons that are already thinking about evening. I took the brass key from my pocket. Mr. Osei had returned it after the meeting, with the quiet practicality of a man handling the logistics of grief. I held it in my palm. The leather loop was dark and smooth, worn to the specific softness of something carried close for a long time. He had carried it a long time. I put it in the drawer beside the photograph. The phone rang while I was still sitting there. I looked at the screen. Callum. I set the phone face down on the bedside table and listened to it ring through to voicemail, which was what I had been doing since Tuesday morning, and which I intended to continue doing until Friday. There was nothing Callum could say before Friday that I needed to hear. There was quite a lot he was going to hear on Friday that he was not prepared for. That asymmetry seemed, for the moment, the correct arrangement. He called 6 more times across Wednesday and Thursday. I know this because I counted, not obsessively, but in the same methodical way I had counted other things across the previous 2 years, the medication refills and the bill review dates and the months since the savings bond had matured. Counting was how I tracked things. 6 calls, 2 voicemails. I listened to both voicemails on Thursday evening, once each, with the particular attention of someone gathering information rather than experiencing emotion. The first was from Wednesday afternoon. Callum's voice was careful, controlled, modulated, the voice he used when he was managing his presentation of himself. He said he had heard from Mr. Osei. He said he wanted to talk before Friday. He said he was sure there were things to discuss and that it would be better for everyone to have a conversation between the two of them first. For everyone, he said, twice. The second was from Thursday morning. The careful modulation was still present, but working harder, the voice of a man whose control is intact, but has begun to cost something. He said he had been trying to understand the extent of the estate. He said he knew Dad had some savings, and he was sure there were accounts he wasn't aware of, and he just wanted to make sure everything was handled properly. He said the word properly with a specific emphasis. He said he was sure I understood that Dad would have wanted them to work together on this. I listened to the voicemail twice. I deleted it. What Callum understood about our father's wishes was, I had come to realize, almost entirely constructed. A version of our father assembled from selective observations and wishful interpretation, calibrated to support whatever Callum found convenient. The real Gerald Patton, the man at the window, the lavender replacer, the 36-year builder, the man who put a bank statement in the wrong drawer and watched to see if I would look, was not a man Callum had ever taken the time to know. He had managed the account he could see. He had never asked about the man behind it. On Thursday evening, I drove to my own flat, the rented functional one with the empty window boxes, and I packed what I needed for Friday morning. I set out the clothes I would wear. I charged my phone. I made a simple dinner and ate it at the table and thought about my father's voice in December. It's done properly, Anna. Everything is in order. I thought about Mr. Osei reading the instructions aloud in his measured voice, while the winter light moved across the floor. I thought about the sealed letter, 3 years in a drawer on Clement Street, waiting for Friday. I went to bed at 10. I slept solidly, which surprised me, not the shallow, watchful sleep of the previous weeks, but something deeper and more complete, the sleep of a person who has been carrying something heavy and has been told, by someone they trust, that they can set it down now. My father had said, "Everything is in order." I believed him. I had always believed him. I slept. Friday arrived gray and cold, the sky the particular flat white of a winter morning that has not decided yet what kind of day it intends to be. I was at the building on Clement Street at 8:52, 3 minutes earlier than Tuesday. I noted this without particular significance. The receptionist showed me to the same chair outside Mr. Osei's door. The harbor photograph was on the wall. I looked at it for 4 minutes this time instead of 8. Then Mr. Osei opened the door and showed me in, and I sat in the same chair, and he sat across the same desk, and the green folder was there again, thicker now, additional documents added for today's reading. "Your brother is on his way," Mr. Osei said. "He should be here within the quarter hour." "All right," I said. "Are you ready?" I thought about the question, whether ready was what I was. "Yes," I said, "I think I am." Mr. Osei nodded. He poured water into 2 glasses and placed one in front of me. Then he paused, and he looked at me with the direct, measured look of a man stepping briefly outside his professional register into something more personal. "Your father spoke of you often," he said. "In our meetings over the years. He stopped, selected the word carefully. Proud is not quite sufficient. He was certain of you. There is a difference." I looked at the glass of water. "Thank you," I said. It came out quietly. "He was right to be," Mr. Osei said, and returned to his professional register as smoothly as he had left it, opening the folder, reviewing his papers, preparing. Callum arrived at 9:17. I heard him before the door opened, his voice in the reception area, asking the receptionist something in the tone that expected an immediate answer. The door opened. He came in with the energy of a man who has been managing his composure for 3 days and is holding it together through momentum rather than genuine calm. He saw me. Something moved across his face. Calculation, adjustment, the rapid micro-assessment of a man determining how to play a room. He sat in the chair beside me rather than across the desk, which was a choice. He said my name. He touched my arm briefly in the gesture of a concerned brother. He told me he was sorry about Dad, which was the first time he had said this to me directly. "Thank you," I said. Mr. Osei opened the folder. He put on his reading glasses. He looked at neither of us. "Shall we begin?" he said. He read the preamble first, the formal language of wills, the dates and the witnesses and the declarations of sound mind. My father's full name, his address, the date of signing, 11 years ago, with amendments noted through to 14 months prior. Callum shifted in his chair when he heard 14 months. I did not look at him. The specific bequests came next. The charity, the cousin in Edinburgh, the church with the vague, persistent obligation. Callum was still. These were small amounts, not what he was waiting for. Then Mr. Osei reached the primary estate. The household account, Mr. Osei read, comprising such funds as remain at the time of death, is subject to a civil recovery action initiated on behalf of the estate, details of which are contained in the accompanying legal documentation. Callum went very still. The action concerns unauthorized transfers made from the household account across a period of 14 months, totaling £63,000. Documentation supporting this action has been assembled and is held in trust. The room was quiet, the kind of quiet that is not peaceful but dense. the quiet of something that has been held under pressure for a long time and has nowhere left to go. "Callum," Mr. Osai said, "without looking up from the folder, there is a letter for you. I will give it to you at the close of this reading." Callum said nothing. I looked at him then. I had been looking at the folder and I looked at him now, because I needed to see his face when he understood. His jaw was set. His hands on the arms of the chair were flat and still in the specific way of hands that are being controlled. His eyes were moving, not around the room, but in the particular internal movement of a man running rapid calculations, assessing exits, determining what was salvageable. He found my eyes. I held his gaze steadily. I did not look away, and I did not look triumphant, and I did not perform anything. I simply looked at him the way my father had looked at me across kitchen tables on Thursday afternoons, directly, warmly, with complete clarity about what was true. He looked away first. Mr. Osai turned to the final page. His voice was unchanged, measured, precise, the voice he had brought into this room and would carry out of it regardless of what happened in between. The principal remainder of the estate, he read, asterisk comprising the family residence and all contents, the investment account held at. He named the firm, the 36-year firm my father had corresponded with by letter, and all associated assets therein, valued at the date of this reading at. He said the number. Callum made a sound. Not a word. A sound, involuntary and brief. The sound of a man who has been certain about the shape of a room and has discovered, in a single sentence, that the room was always larger than he knew. This remainder, Mr. Osai continued, in exactly the same voice, as though a man had not just made an involuntary sound beside me. The testator leaves in its entirety to his daughter, Anna Ruth Patton. The reason attached to this bequest, in the testator's own words, is as follows. He read, "Anna showed up, every Tuesday, every Thursday, every Saturday. She showed up when it was inconvenient and when it cost her and when nobody was keeping score. She asked about me, not about what I had. She found what I left for her to find and she said nothing and kept looking and said nothing and kept showing up. I have been watching my children for 36 years. I know what I saw. Anna is the one who came. Everything I built belongs to her because she is the only one I built it with." The room was very quiet. Mr. Ose closed the folder. He removed his reading glasses. He placed them on the desk with the careful precision of a man completing a task he has been trusted with and has performed to the best of his ability. Callum did not speak for a long time. When he did, his voice was different, the composure not gone exactly, but altered. Thinner. The voice of a man who has discovered that the performance he has been giving for years was playing to an audience that saw through it entirely and had simply been waiting for the appropriate moment to say so. "He knew," Callum said, not a question. "Yes," I said. "The whole time." "Yes." He looked at the folder on the desk, at the harbor photograph on the wall, at the glass of water in front of him that he had not touched. "The letter," he said finally. Mr. Ose, I reached into the folder and produced an envelope, cream-colored, sealed, Callum's name in my father's handwriting across the front. The same handwriting from Thursday afternoons, from the papers on the desk in the study, from 36 years of a man who wrote carefully and meant what he wrote. Mr. Ose placed it on the desk in front of Callum. Callum looked at it for a long moment. He did not pick it up. Then he stood carefully, with the movements of someone navigating a body that feels suddenly unreliable, and he picked up the envelope and he put it in the inside pocket of his jacket. He looked at me. What I saw in his face then was something I had not anticipated and have not forgotten. Not anger. I had expected anger. Not calculation. What I saw was something older and quieter than either of those. Something that looked, for a single unguarded moment, like grief, genuine grief, the kind that arrives when you understand not just what you have lost, but what you failed to earn while it was still earnable. He had managed the account he could see. He had never asked about the man behind it. Now the man was gone, and the letter was in his jacket, and the account he had managed and the house he had expected and the number he had not known existed all had the same answer, and that answer was, Anna showed up. "I'll see myself out," he said. He walked to the door. He opened it. He closed it behind him with the careful quiet of a man who has nothing left to perform loudness for. I sat in the chair in the quiet office on Clement Street and listened to his footsteps in the reception area, and then the lift, and then nothing. Mr. Ose sat across the desk with his hands folded and said nothing, which was exactly right. Outside the window, the flat white sky had resolved, while we had been inside, into something definite, not blue exactly, but lighter, the clouds thinning at the edges the way clouds do when the day has finally made up its mind. I looked at the harbor photograph. I thought about my father at 22, standing in front of the car he would sell 6 months later. Young and broke and already beginning, already saving the first paycheck, already building something in the particular silence of a person who has decided not to tell anyone what they are building until it is built. 36 years. What happens now? I said. Not about the legal proceedings, I understood those. I meant something wider, something I was asking myself as much as Mr. Osa. He understood. He was that kind of lawyer. Now, he said, you do whatever the person your father raised would do. I thought about that. I thought about Tuesdays. If you have stayed with me through this office and this folder and this quiet Friday morning, what comes next is not about Callum. It is not about the money or the account or the case my father built on Thursday afternoons. It is about what Anna found in a drawer in his study on a Saturday afternoon, what he had been keeping, and for how long. Leave me a comment. Tell me one person who built something for you in silence that you only understood later. I read every single one. Stay with me. The house felt different on Saturday morning. Not in any physical sense. The rooms were the same rooms. The lavender was in the same bowl. The burn mark was on the same corner of the kitchen table. The maple in the front yard stood where it had always stood, bare and patient in the January cold, its branches holding the particular stillness of a tree that has weathered enough winters to know that stillness is the correct response to cold. What was different was the quality of my presence in it. On every previous morning I had come through that door, I had come as a visitor, a regular, loving, necessary visitor, but a visitor nonetheless. Someone who showed up and then left. Someone who sorted the medications and reviewed the bills and ate soup at the table and drove away in the evenings back to the functional flat with the empty window boxes. This morning I came through the door as the person the house belonged to, and the difference was not legal. The legal reality had existed since Friday, but felt, which is a different and more significant kind of reality. I stood in the hallway, and the house settled around me in the particular way of a place that has been waiting to belong to someone and has finally been told who. I put my bag down at the foot of the stairs. I took off my coat and hung it on the hook beside the door, not the good hook, which had been my father's, which I intended to leave for a while yet. The second hook. My hook, going back to childhood, the one at the height it had been placed for me at 8 years old and which nobody had ever moved. I went to the kitchen. I filled the kettle. I stood at the window above the sink while it heated and looked at the winter garden, the bare beds, the stripped rose canes, the apple tree at the far end that my father had planted the same year as the maple, and that produced, every September, more apples than one person could eat, and which he had dealt with by leaving bags of them on the neighbors' doorsteps without notes. I would do that in September. I made that decision at the kitchen window on a Saturday morning in January, with the kettle beginning to hiss behind me, in the simple declarative way that decisions make themselves when you are standing in the right place. The tea made itself. I carried the mug to the kitchen table and sat in my father's chair, not the chair I had always sat in across from him, but his chair, the one that faced the window. I had never sat in it before. It faced the garden at a slightly different angle than I was used to, the apple tree more central, the side fence less so. A small difference. A different version of the same garden. I sat in it for a long time. My phone buzzed once on the table. I looked at the screen. Not Callum. He had not called since Friday, which was either the beginning of sense or the beginning of a different strategy, and I did not yet know which. It was Mr. Osai. A short message. Civil recovery filing submitted this morning. You will receive copies by post early next week. No action required from you at this stage. I set the phone down. I looked at the garden. My father had filed the paperwork before he died. He had instructed Mr. Osai precisely. He had built the case across 14 months of Thursday afternoons while I sorted bills at the same table, and he had handed it to his lawyer in its complete form. And all that had been required after his death was for Mr. Osai to press send on a filing that had been ready for months. The patience of the man. The absolute, thoroughgoing, 36-year patience of the man. I want to tell you about the letter. Not its contents. Those belonged to Callum, and Callum had not shared them, and I had not asked. And I did not intend to ask because what my father had written to his son in that sealed envelope 3 years ago was between the two of them in a way that my knowing would not improve. My father had understood something about privacy and dignity, and the things that should be said directly rather than witnessed, and the letter was one of those things. What I can tell you is what Callum told me himself 3 weeks later, when he called on a Sunday afternoon. Not the controlled, calculating calls of the previous week, but a different kind of call, quieter. The voice of a man who has read something and sat with it long enough to arrive somewhere he had not expected. He called at 2 in the afternoon. I answered because the quality of the silence before the call, the way the phone rang differently, somehow, or I perceived it differently, told me that this call was not the previous calls. I read it, he said. I know, I said. A pause, long enough to mean something. He knew everything, Callum said. From the beginning, he wrote, he stopped. He said he wasn't angry. He said he had made it easy for me by giving me access and that he had done that on purpose. To see. I held the phone and looked at the garden through the kitchen window. The same garden, the apple tree, the bare rose canes. The same view my father had looked at from this chair for 34 years. He did it on purpose, Callum said, the words arriving slowly as though he was still assembling them into their full meaning. He gave me the account because he already knew what I would do with it. He wanted to know for certain. He said another stop. He said he wanted to be wrong, that he hoped every month that he would be wrong. The call went quiet, not uncomfortably, the silence of two people sitting with something large and shared. He was never wrong about people, I said eventually. No, Callum said, he wasn't. Another silence. The letter says he forgives me, Callum said. His voice had changed again, something underneath the composure now, something that was the composure's opposite, the genuine, unguarded thing the composure had been managing. He says he has been forgiving me for years. He says, a breath. He says he's sorry he made it easy. I sat in my father's chair in my father's kitchen with my cold tea on the table in front of me, and I thought about Gerald Patton at his desk in the study, 3 years ago, writing a letter to his son that he would seal and give to his lawyer and never mention again. Writing that he was sorry for making it easy, that he hoped every month to be wrong. The love in that, the particular complicated love of a parent who sees a child clearly and loves them anyway, and is sorry for the conditions they created and forgives them for the use those conditions were put to. All of it in a sealed letter, all of it waiting. I'm going to repay it, Callum said. The $63,000. I spoke to my bank this morning. I had not expected this. Or perhaps I had. Perhaps the letter had contained something that made this the inevitable next step, the only move available to a man who has been told by his dead father that he was hoped to be wrong about. You don't have to, I said. "I know," he said. "I'm going to anyway." The call ended shortly after. No warmth exactly. We were not, at that stage, in a place where warmth was available to us, the damage being what it was and trust being the thing that accumulates slowly and depletes fast and cannot be manufactured on a Sunday afternoon. But something else. Something that was not the end of a thing, but possibly, distantly, the beginning of a different thing that neither of us could yet see the full shape of. I set the phone on the table. I looked at the garden. My father had hoped every month to be wrong. He had built the whole 36-year edifice on the hope that it would not be needed, that the daughter who showed up would not need to be protected from the son who didn't. He had built it anyway, because hope and preparation are not opposites, and because the kind of love he had was the kind that made both at once. I went to the study that afternoon. I sat at his desk for the first time, carefully, with the particular reverence of occupying a space that still held someone else's shape. The papers on the desk were his papers, organized in his system, the categories and labels of a man who had always known exactly where everything was. Underneath the top layer of current correspondence, filed in the second drawer down, I found something I had not been looking for. A notebook, small, green-covered, spiral-bound, my name on the front in his handwriting. "For Anna, when you're ready." I opened it at the kitchen table with fresh tea and the January afternoon going gray outside the window. It was not a journal exactly, or not only a journal. It was a record and a letter and something between the two. Entries spanning several years, some long, some brief, all in the steady, unhurried handwriting of a man who chose his words carefully and meant every one. The first entry was dated 7 years ago. Anna called today to ask if I needed anything from the shops. I didn't. She came anyway, brought apples from the market. We sat in the kitchen for 2 hours. She asked about the car I sold in 1972. I haven't thought about that car in years. I thought about it all evening after she left. I don't know why she asked about it. I think she simply wanted to know. I turned the page. Tuesday, Anna sorted the medication again. The system she built is better than the one Callum set up, more practical, less about appearance. This seems right for both of them. Another page. She brought soup today, said she had made too much. She had not made too much. She made extra on purpose and did not want me to feel that I was being managed. I am being managed in the best possible sense by someone who understands that dignity matters as much as care. I don't know where she learned that. Probably her mother. I sat at the table while the afternoon went dark outside the window. Entry after entry. Tuesdays and Thursdays and Saturdays, going back 7 years, further back than I had been coming with intention, back to visits I had not thought of as anything more than ordinary, back to Sundays when I had stopped by without a plan and he had simply been glad. He had written them all down. Every one. Not because he was building a case. The case was in Mr. Osai's office, assembled from bank records and financial documents and forensic accountants' reports. This was something else. This was a man writing down the things that mattered to him in the particular way of people who understand that the things that matter most are the ones most easily forgotten, and who refuse to let them be forgotten. He had been writing me down for 7 years. He had been keeping me the way you keep something precious, carefully, quietly, in a place where it would not be disturbed. The last entry was dated 3 weeks before he died. His handwriting was different by then, slower, the letters less certain, the effort of it visible in the pressure of the pen. But legible, entirely legible. He had made sure of that. Anna came today. She sorted the medication and made tea and sat with me while the radio played. She didn't ask me how I was feeling. She knows how I am feeling. She asked me instead what I remembered about the summer of 1987, which is the year she was born, and I told her about the morning in August when her mother rang me at work, and I left without telling anyone where I was going and drove through every red light between the office and the hospital. Anna laughed. I hadn't thought about those red lights in years. She is going to be all right, whatever comes next. She is going to be more than all right. I am certain of this the way I am certain of the maple. It takes a long time, and then it's the most beautiful thing on the street. I closed the notebook. I sat at the kitchen table with my hands flat on the cover, in the house that was mine now, in the chair that had been his, with the garden going dark beyond the window and the lavender in the bowl in the hallway, and the burn mark from 1997 under my left elbow. I did not cry immediately. I sat for a while first. I sat the way he had taught me to sit with things, fully, without rushing toward the next moment, giving the present one the complete attention it deserved. Then I cried. The kind of crying that comes from somewhere below grief, below even love, in the place where the two things live together and cannot be separated. I cried for the man at the window, for the replaced lavender, for 36 years of quiet building, for the red lights he drove through in August of 1987 and had not thought about in years until a Tuesday afternoon when his daughter asked. For the entry that said, "She is going to be more than all right." I cried until I was finished. Then I dried my face with the dish towel that hung on the oven handle, which was his dish towel, which smelled faintly of the kitchen it had always lived in. I folded it back over the handle. I put the kettle on. Outside, the maple stood in the dark in the front yard, bare, patient, 34 years old and taller than the house and in the right light, which was any light, the most beautiful thing on the street. I was going to be all right. He had been certain of it long before I was. And he had written it down in his careful, unhurried hand, so that when the moment came when I needed to know it, the knowing would be there waiting for me. In a drawer, in a notebook, with my name on the front. For Anna, when you're ready. The civil recovery letter arrived on a Wednesday morning 3 weeks after the will reading. I was in the kitchen when it came, standing at the counter with my coffee, looking at the garden in the particular unfocused way of early mornings when the mind is present but not yet fully deployed. The post slot in the front door made its small sound, the one I was still learning as a daily detail of this house, rather than an occasional visitor's observation, and I set my coffee down and went to the hallway. 3 envelopes, a utility bill, something from the council, and a thick cream envelope from Mr. Osai's office, marked for my attention, the kind of envelope whose weight tells you before you open it that it contains something that has been prepared with care. I took all 3 to the kitchen table. I opened Mr. Osai's envelope first. The filing was clean and complete. The forensic accountant's report, the transfer records, the timeline assembled across 14 months of Thursday afternoons at this same table. £63,000, documented with the irrefutable precision of financial records that do not negotiate and do not soften and do not care whose son the recipient was. Mr. Osai's covering letter was brief. The filing had been submitted. The response period was 30 days. No action was required from me. He would be in touch when there were developments. I read it twice. I set it on the table. Then I picked up my coffee and went back to the window and looked at the garden. The rose canes needed cutting back. I had been meaning to do it since I moved in and had not yet done it, partly from inexperience and partly from a reluctance to interfere with my father's arrangements before I fully understood them. He had a system for the garden, as he had a system for everything. I had found notes about it in the study. Seasonal schedules, planting records, the names of the varieties in each bed written in his careful hand on small cards tucked into the soil at the base of each plant. He had left instructions for the garden the way he had left instructions for everything. Quietly, in writing, in the right place for the right person to find them. I was going to need to learn roses. Callum's response to the civil recovery filing arrived not through Mr. Ose, but directly. A call on the following Sunday, the second Sunday since the reading. his voice carrying the specific quality of a man who has spent a week with a solicitor and emerged with a clearer understanding of his position than he had previously held. "I'm not contesting it," he said. No preamble, no careful modulation. Simply the statement, flat and final. "All right," I said. "My solicitor says I could. He says the documentation would be difficult, but there are arguments." A pause. I told him I wasn't contesting it. I looked at the garden through the kitchen window. The rose canes, the apple tree, the maple visible at the corner of the house, its bare upper branches holding the gray February sky. "Why not?" I said. A silence that was not evasive, but considering. "Because Dad knew," Callum said. "He documented it. He built the whole case himself while I thought I was managing it." Another pause. "You don't contest something your father built a case for from his desk on Thursday afternoons. That's not," he stopped. "It's not something I'm able to do." I had not expected this either. The Callum I had been preparing for, the one whose voicemails I had listened to with careful, investigative attention in the days before the reading, would have contested it, would have found the arguments and deployed them, and managed the presentation of himself throughout with the practiced ease of a man who had learned that composure performed consistently was often mistaken for integrity. The letter had done something to that Callum. Something had shifted in the room between the sealed envelope and the man who walked out carrying it, and whatever had shifted had not shifted back. "The repayment," he said. "I told you I'd arrange it. It'll be with Mr. Osai's office by end of the month. Full amount." "Callum." "I know you don't need it," he said. "That's not the point." "What is the point?" A silence, long enough to contain something real. "He said in the letter that he hoped every month to be wrong," Callum said. "About me. He said he hoped for 36 years that he was building something he would never need to use." His voice was steady but working to be. I would like it if that amount of money could go somewhere that isn't just evidence of what I did. I'd like it to go somewhere it does something." I sat with that. "I'll think about it," I said. "That's all I'm asking," he said. The repayment arrived on the last Thursday of February, transferred to Mr. Osai's client account with the quiet efficiency of a financial transaction that has been organized by someone who wanted it done cleanly and without drama. Mr. Ose confirmed it by email. £63,000 in full, with a week to spare in the response period. I read the email at the kitchen table on a Thursday morning. Thursday, the day of the bill reviews, the day of the gas bill and the medication schedules and the soup. The day my father and I had sat across this table, in these chairs, for 2 years of ordinary Thursday afternoons that he had been writing down in a green notebook and filing in the second drawer of his desk. I thought it was a reasonable day for £63,000 to arrive. I thought about what Callum had said. Somewhere that does something. He had not been specific, and I had not asked him to be, because the specificity was mine to determine, and he had understood that and stepped back from it with a grace I had not anticipated, and that I was still, quietly, adjusting to. I had been thinking about it since the Sunday call. My father had funded things quietly his entire life. The charity, the cousin in Edinburgh, the church with the vague obligation. He had not made announcements. He had simply identified where something was needed and put something there, and said nothing about it. The practice of a man who understood that the most durable generosity was the kind that did not require an audience. I had been watching him do it my whole life, without understanding. That was what I was watching. By March, I had spoken to Mr. Osai twice more, once about the civil recovery closure, which was completed without complication, and once about a different matter that I had been considering since the morning I found the garden notes in the study. The seasonal schedules, the planting records, the small cards in the soil. My father had been, among other things, a consistent donor to a horticultural education program that ran out of a community center 2 streets from the house. A Saturday morning program for children from the surrounding estate who would not otherwise have access to a garden or to the particular education that gardens provide. He had been donating since the program began, 12 years ago. His name was not on any list. The program coordinator, a woman named Vera who had called to offer condolences after my father's death and mentioned in passing that she had known him through the program, had described his support as anonymous and unwavering for over a decade. 12 years of Saturday mornings, quietly funded, never mentioned. I met Vera on a Tuesday in March. Of course it was a Tuesday at the community center. She was a compact, energetic woman in her 50s who showed me around the program with the particular pride of someone doing work they know matters and have been doing long enough to have proof. Children learning to grow things in raised beds in a room with large windows and good light. Seedlings in small pots on every windowsill, labeled in children's handwriting. The smell of earth and growing things in the middle of a building, in the middle of a city, in the middle of winter. She showed me the planting schedule on the wall, hand-drawn, colorful, annotated with the accumulated wisdom of 12 years of Saturday mornings. It was organized the same way my father organized things. I looked at it for a long moment. Did he help design this? I asked. Vera smiled. He wrote the first one, she said, 12 years ago, on a Saturday morning. He said he'd been growing things for 30 years and had opinions about sequencing. Of course he had. I told Vera I wanted to continue his support. She nodded without surprise, as though she had been expecting this conversation since the condolence call. We discussed what the program needed: more space, a second growing season, resources for a summer expansion that had been planned for 3 years and deferred for 3 years for the same reason most good things are deferred. I wrote a number on a piece of paper and pushed it across her desk. She looked at it for a moment. "This is," she said. "For the expansion," I said, "and for the next 10 years of Saturday mornings." He would have wanted the Saturdays continued. Vera looked at the number, and then at me, and then at the seedlings on the windowsill, and then back at the number. "He talked about you," she said, "on the Saturday mornings when he came in to check on things. He talked about his daughter who taught." "He came in," I said. "Every few months," she said, "to see how the beds were doing. He never stayed long. He always said he was just passing." He was never just passing. He was watching, quietly from windows and doorways, from the corner of rooms and the edge of conversations, from 36 years of Thursday afternoon records and Saturday morning visits to a garden program 2 streets from his house. He was always watching the things he loved, making sure they were growing. I walked home from the community center on a Tuesday afternoon in March, through streets that were beginning their first tentative movement towards spring, not warm yet, not quite, but different from February in the specific way of air that has decided something. The light was different, lower still, but with a quality that had been absent since October. The maple in the front yard had the first faint suggestion of buds at the tips of its branches, not visible yet, not quite, but there if you were the kind of person who looked. I was the kind of person who looked. I let myself into the house. I hung my coat on the second hook. I went to the kitchen and put the kettle on and stood at the window above the sink while it heated, looking at the garden. The rose canes. I had been meaning to do them since January. I found his gardening gloves on the shelf in the shed, the heavy leather ones, worn to the shape of his hands, the right one more worn than the left from 34 years of use. I put them on. They were too large, but serviceable, the leather still supple, still good, still entirely capable of the work it had been made for. I went to the roses. I did not entirely know what I was doing. I had the seasonal schedule from the study, which helped, and I had the specific cards in the soil beside each plant. And I had the memory of watching him do it from the kitchen window on Saturday mornings when I had been visiting, and he had gone out without explaining where he was going, and I had trusted that he knew. I worked carefully, slowly, following the instructions he had left in his own handwriting in the right place for the right person to find. It took 2 hours. By the time I finished, the light was going, the early going of a March evening, the sky moving through its shades, and I stood up slowly and looked at what I had done, and it looked, to my inexperienced eye, approximately correct. The canes were cut. The beds were cleared. The soil had the clean, expectant look of a thing that has been tended and is now waiting for what comes next. I pulled off the gloves. I held them for a moment, the leather warm from my hands, the shape of his hands still in them underneath my own. I put them back on the shelf in the shed, in the same place, the right place. Back in the kitchen, kettle on again, I sat at the table in his chair and looked at the garden through the window. The cut rose canes, the cleared beds, the apple tree at the far end, its own suggestion of buds gathering. He had tended this garden for 34 years. I had tended it for one afternoon. It seemed like a beginning. On the table beside my mug was the green notebook. I had been carrying it between rooms with me since I found it, the way you carry something you are not yet ready to put down. I opened it to the last entry, the slower handwriting, the certain words. She is going to be more than all right. I am certain of this the way I am certain of the maple. I closed the notebook. I looked at the garden. I looked at the maple, visible at the corner of the house, its bare branches now unmistakably, undeniably, if you looked, beginning. He had planted it the year he and my mother moved in, before I was born, before Callum, before any of the particular shape of our family had been determined. He had planted it because he intended to stay, and because he understood that the things worth having took time, and because he was the kind of man who planted trees whose full height he would not live to see, and found this not sad but correct. 34 years later, it was the most beautiful thing on the street. I picked up my phone. I opened a new document, blank, untitled, the cursor waiting. I sat for a moment, thinking about what to put at the top of it. Then I typed, things Dad taught me that I only understood later. I sat with the blank space beneath it for a long time. Then I began to write. If you are still here, if you have walked through this house and these Thursday afternoons and this garden with me, then you already know what the last part is about. It isn't about the money. It isn't about Callum or Mr. Osai or the green folder on the plain desk. It's about what you do with what someone built for you, how you carry it forward, how you make it worth the 36 years. Leave me a comment before we go to the final part. Tell me one thing someone built for you in silence that you only fully understood after they were gone. I read every single one. I carry them with me. The last part is coming. Stay with me. Spring arrived the way my father had always said it arrived in this garden. Not all at once, not with any announcement or dramatic shift, but incrementally, detail by detail, the way a careful person builds something. First, the snowdrops at the base of the apple tree, small and precise and entirely certain of themselves, despite the cold that was still present and still had opinions. Then the first leaves on the maple, the same blush of green at the tips that the orange of autumn had been at the other end of the season, the tree changing from the crown down, arriving at itself from the outside in. Then the roses. The first bud appeared on a Tuesday morning in April, the climber on the south-facing wall, the one my father's cards identified as an old variety, planted the year my mother and he moved in, the same year as the maple and the apple tree. Everything he had planted that first year was still here. Everything he had planted with the intention of staying had stayed. I was at the kitchen window with my coffee when I saw it, a tight-closed bud, deep pink, at the second node from the top of the cane I had cut back in March following his handwritten instructions. I set the coffee down. I went outside in my socks, which he would have considered impractical and which I considered worth it. I stood in front of the rose and looked at the bud for a long time. There it is, I thought. In his voice, which is how I thought about the garden now, in his voice, with his particular mix of satisfaction and understatement, the voice of a man for whom a rosebud on a Tuesday in April was exactly what was supposed to happen and was no less worth noticing for being exactly that. I went back inside. I put my socks in the airing cupboard. I finished my coffee standing at the window, watching the bud in the early April light, and I thought about the first Saturday morning program session of the expanded year, which was in 4 days. I had been thinking about it since March. Vera had called in the 3rd week of March to say the expansion was confirmed, the additional growing space secured, the summer program scheduled, the resources in place. She said it with the contained excitement of a person who has been trying to make something happen for 3 years and has learned not to celebrate too early. And then she said it again with slightly less containment when I asked her to. He would have been pleased, she said. He was already pleased, I said. He came to check on the beds. A small silence on the line. Yes, she said, he did. The Saturday morning of the first expanded session, I arrived at the community center at 8:30. The program began at 9, but Vera had asked if I wanted to come early to see the setup, and I had said yes in the immediate way. That means the answer was already decided, and the question was a formality. The room was different with the expansion. 2 additional growing tables along the east wall, under the large windows where the light was best in the morning. New raised beds, the soil already prepared, the planting schedule on the wall updated with the new spring sequence in Vera's handwriting alongside the original sections in my father's. His handwriting on the wall. I stood in front of it for a moment. He did the first one 12 years ago, Vera said, beside me. Every time we updated it, we kept his original sections. Nobody suggested it. We just didn't remove them. They seemed like they should stay. Of course they did. The things he put in the right place had a way of being recognized as belonging there. The children arrived at 9. 14 of them this year, 6 from the previous year, 8 new, ranging from 7 to 12, carrying the specific energy of children on a Saturday morning who are somewhere they chose to be rather than somewhere they were sent. They came in with their coats still on, and their attention already directed at the growing tables, the seedlings on the windowsills, the new beds along the east wall that hadn't been there last autumn. I helped Vera with the morning. Not as an authority, I knew less about growing things than most of the returning children, who had a year of Saturday mornings behind them. As an extra pair of hands, a person who could hold a tray of seedlings while small hands transferred them to pots with the careful, concentrated attention that children bring to delicate tasks when they understand the delicacy is real. A boy named Marcus, 8 years old, with the focused expression of a person for whom precision matters, was transplanting basil seedlings one by one with a small trowel, his tongue at the corner of his mouth, each seedling set into its pot with the same deliberate care. He looked up at me when he finished the last one. "Is that right?" he said. I looked at the row of pots, evenly spaced, each seedling upright and settled. "That's exactly right," I said. He looked at the pots for a moment with the quiet satisfaction of a person who has done a thing correctly and knows it. Then he moved on to the next task with the same focused attention, and I watched him go and thought about my father at his desk writing planting schedules in his careful hand, and about the card tucked into the soil at the base of the rose climber, old variety, planted first year, south-facing wall, and about the way precision and care and the willingness to do a thing correctly regardless of audience are the same quality at 8 years old as they are at 71. You show up, you do the thing correctly, you move on to the next thing. He had been teaching me this since before I knew I was being taught. I drove home from the community center at noon, through streets that were fully spring now, The trees along the main road in leaf, the light different, the air carrying the particular warmth of a season that has committed. I drove past the end of Clement Street without turning in and thought briefly of Mr. Ose in his office with the green folders and the harbor photograph, and felt toward him the specific gratitude you feel for a person who handled something important with complete skill and complete discretion, and asked for nothing in return except the fee, which I had paid, and which had seemed entirely inadequate. I would find a way to express it better, later. The house received me the way it received me now, as though it had been waiting specifically for me. I hung my coat on the second hook. I went to the kitchen. I put the kettle on. Ritual, by now not obligation but genuine comfort, the comfort of a repeated action that has become, through repetition, a form of belonging. While the kettle heated, I opened the document on my laptop. The one I had begun in March, things Dad taught me that I only understood later. I had been adding to it since then. Not systematically, not with a plan, but as things occurred to me, in the garden, at the Saturday program, at the kitchen table on Thursday mornings when I still reviewed bills, still went through the accounts, still kept the same methodical records he had kept because his systems were good, and I had learned them and they were mine now. The document was 4 pages long. I scrolled through it slowly. The entries were not organized. They were the organic record of a woman understanding things in the order that understanding arrived, which is never the order you would choose if you were choosing. He never reached for a thing until he knew exactly what he was reaching for. I thought this was caution. It was precision. There is a difference. He put the lavender in the bowl every summer after Mum died. He never mentioned it. He just kept doing it. This is what continuing looks like when you love someone who is gone. He said, nobody asks you for what they don't know you have. I thought he meant financial privacy. He meant something larger. He meant, keep your most important things close until you know who is safe to give them to. He watched from windows because watching was how he loved. Not passively, actively, attentively, the watching of a person who is paying full attention and remembers what they see. I added a new entry. He funded things he never mentioned for 12 years, a garden program for children on Saturday mornings. He went to check on the bed sometimes, saying he was just passing. He was never just passing. He was watching something he loved grow. This is the same thing he did with me. This is the same thing he did with the maple. He tended things quietly and let them find their own size. I read it back. It seemed right. It seemed true. I closed the laptop. The kettle had boiled while I was writing. The water was slightly past temperature. He would have considered this a small failure of attention and would have noted it without criticism. I made the tea anyway. It was fine. Sometimes things are fine even when they are not precisely correct, and learning the difference between the imprecision that matters and the imprecision that doesn't was something I was still working out. He had known the difference instinctively. I would learn it. It would take time. That seemed appropriate. I carried the tea to the kitchen table and sat in his chair and looked at the garden. The rose cane on the south wall was not visible from this angle, but I knew the bud was there, tight, deep pink, certain of itself in the April afternoon. The beds I had cleared in March were showing the first green of the things I had planted following his schedule, small and tentative and unmistakably alive. The apple tree was in blossom, white flowers against the blue sky, the particular white that apple blossom is, which is not quite any other white. The garden was working. His systems were working. I was learning to tend them. On the table beside my mug was the green notebook. Still there, still carried between rooms, though less urgently now, not the desperate carrying of the first weeks, but the comfortable proximity of something you want near without needing to hold. I opened it to the last entry. I read it for what was probably the 15th time, in the slower handwriting, the certain words. She is going to be more than all right. I am certain of this the way I am certain of the maple. I looked at the entry for a long time. Then I turned to the page after it, blank, the lines waiting, the same blank space that had been waiting since he had written the last entry 3 weeks before he died. I picked up the pen from the table. I thought about what to write, whether it was right to write in his notebook, after his last entry, in my own handwriting beneath his, whether that was a trespass or a continuation. I decided it was a continuation. He would have agreed. He would have said that the things worth doing were the things that continued, that the point of a garden was not the gardener, but what the gardener left behind and what grew from it. I wrote one line beneath his last entry. My handwriting, which was smaller than his and less certain but legible, he had always insisted on legibility. You were right, Dad. You were right about all of it. I'm still showing up. I closed the notebook. I set the pen down. I looked at the garden through the window in the April afternoon light, the blossoming apple, the cleared beds beginning to green, the rose cane on the south wall with its single certain bud, and I felt, for the first time since the January morning I had sat at this table with cold coffee and 11 hours of grief behind me, something that was not the absence of sorrow, but the presence of something alongside it. Steadiness. The specific, low, reliable steadiness of a person who has been given good foundations and knows how to build on them. He had been building them since 1987. Since before I was born. Since the year he opened the investment account, and the year he planted the maple, and the year he drove through every red light between the office and the hospital on an August morning, and arrived to find that the person he had been waiting for had arrived. He had been building toward this Tuesday in April for 36 years. And I was here, in his chair, in his kitchen, in the house he had kept ready for me. Showing up. Summer arrived without asking permission, the way summers do in this part of the country. One morning, the light was the tentative, provisional light of late spring, and the next it was something fuller and more committed, the garden responding to it with the uncomplicated enthusiasm of things that have been waiting for exactly this. The roses opened in June. All of them, not just the climber on the south wall, but the ones in the beds, the ones whose cards I had been reading and rereading since March, learning their names and their histories, and the specific conditions they preferred. The climber went first, the deep pink bud I had checked on in my socks in April opening into something larger and more layered than I had anticipated, the color intensifying as it opened rather than fading. Then the beds, one variety at a time, the sequence following the order his schedule had predicted with the calm accuracy of a document written by someone who had watched this happen 34 times and knew exactly what was coming. I learned to deadhead in June. He had left instructions for this too, a card near the shears in the shed, brief and practical, with a small diagram. I followed the diagram carefully the first time and then less carefully as the weeks progressed, and my hands began to develop the knowledge that hands develop only through repetition. The difference between the spent bloom and the new bud, the angle of the cut, the specific resistance of a healthy cane under the shears. By July, I was deadheading without the card. By August, I was doing it in the early mornings before coffee, which I understood was what he had done. The evidence was in the notebook, an entry from a July 5 years ago, up early, deadheaded the climber before breakfast. Good way to start a Tuesday. I read that entry on a Tuesday morning in August, standing at his desk with the notebook open, still in my dressing gown, the smell of the garden coming through the window he had always left open in summer. I laughed, out loud to myself in the empty study, the specific laugh of recognizing yourself in someone else's habit, the laugh of understanding that you have been shaped by a person more completely than you knew. Good way to start a Tuesday. Yes, it was. The apple tree delivered in September. This I had been anticipating since the blossom in April, watching the fruit develop through the summer, the small green spheres appearing after the flowers fell and growing gradually heavier through June and July and August. By the first week of September, they were full and ready, the branches bowing slightly under the weight in the particular way of fruit trees in a good year, which this was. I picked them on a Saturday morning. He had left instructions for this too. Of course, he had a page in the garden notebook that covered harvesting, storage, and what he referred to simply as distribution, a word choice that had made me smile when I first read it. Distribution. As though the neighbor's apples were a logistical operation requiring planning. Which I discovered they were. He had a system. Of course he had a system. The neighbors who received apples were listed in order of proximity. 8 households on the immediate street, 4 on the adjacent road, 2 further away whose circumstances he had noted in brackets beside their names with the quiet attentiveness of a man who paid attention to his community, without advertising the fact. The elderly woman at number 12 who lived alone. The young family at number 7 who had moved in the previous year with 3 children and a persistent air of cheerful overextension. The man at the far end of the adjacent road who had waved at my father every morning for 20 years, and whose name my father had never learned, but whose well-being he had apparently tracked with quiet concern. I filled the bags on Saturday afternoon. Brown paper bags, the same kind he had used. I found a supply of them in the shed, folded flat, a dozen or more, waiting. I filled each one with the same amount, wrapped the necks closed, and wrote nothing on them because he had written nothing on them and the anonymity was the point. Then I went out. It took 40 minutes. Door to door, porch to porch, setting each bag down quietly, not knocking, not waiting to be seen. The elderly woman at number 12 had her front window open. I heard her radio, the afternoon program, the same station my father had listened to, the music from the 40s that he had said reminded him of his own father's house. I set the bag beside her door. I walked away before she could look out. The young family at number 7 had a bicycle on the porch and 3 pairs of small Wellington boots in ascending sizes arranged beside the door with the impractical optimism of parents who believe their children will put boots back in the right place. I set the bag between the boots and the bicycle. I stepped over a piece of chalk someone had been drawing with on the path. The man at the far end of the adjacent road, the one my father had waved at every morning for 20 years, was in his front garden when I arrived. Older than I expected, 70s perhaps, with the deliberate movements of someone managing a body that had become effortful. He looked up when he heard my footstep on the path. I held out the bag. "From the apple tree," I said, "on Calder Street, my father's tree." He looked at the bag, then at me. Something moved across his face. "Gerald's tree," he said. "Yes." He took the bag carefully, with both hands, the way you take something given with intention. "I heard he'd gone," he said. "I'm sorry. He was a good man to wave to." A good man to wave to. I turned that over on the walk home, through the September afternoon streets, the bag lighter now, the distribution complete. A good man to wave to. Not a great man, not an important man, a good man, which is the better thing, the harder thing, the thing that requires consistency rather than occasion. He had been a good man to wave to for 20 years without knowing the name of the man he was waving at. He had tracked that man's well-being in a garden notebook and left him apples every September and thought nothing more of it than that it was the right thing to do. The right thing, done quietly, every year. I got home as the afternoon light was going golden, the specific September light that makes everything it touches look like something worth keeping. I let myself in. I hung up my coat. I went to the kitchen and put the kettle on and stood at the window. The apple tree stood in the afternoon light, its branches lighter now, relieved of the summer's weight. It would rest through autumn and winter and produce again next September, and the September after that, and as long as the tree stood and the garden was tended it would keep producing, quietly, without announcement, reliably. because that was what it had been planted to do. He had planted it the year he moved in. 34 years of September apples. I intended to continue. My phone buzzed on the counter. I looked at the screen. Callum. Not the calculating calls of January, not the careful managed calls of February. This was different, a shorter ring, the kind that means a brief thing rather than a significant one. I answered. Just calling, he said. 3 words. No agenda behind them, or none I could detect. All right, I said. How's the garden? I looked at the apple tree through the window. The apples were good this year, I said. I did the distribution this afternoon. A pause, short. The bags. Yes. He did those every September, Callum said. I remember him going out with the bags. I never asked where he was going. The kitchen was quiet. The kettle had boiled while we were talking. Steam rising from the spout, the small sound of it subsiding. He went to 8 houses on the street, I said. 4 on the adjacent road. 2 further away, the elderly woman at 12 and the man at the far end of Birch Road. He never told me that. He didn't tell anyone, I said. That was the point. Another pause, longer this time. Was he, Callum stopped, started differently. When you were there on Tuesdays, was he all right? Was he content? I thought about the question carefully. About the radio on Thursday afternoons. About the photograph of the 22-year-old in the bedside drawer. About the conversation in December with the specific, satisfied tone of a man who had completed something large and done it well. Yes, I said. He was content. I think he was genuinely happy in those last months. The talking was good. He had things he wanted to say and he said them. He didn't say them to me, Callum said. Not bitterly, simply. No, I said, he didn't. A long silence, honest, the kind that doesn't need to be filled. I'm going to try to be better at showing up, Callum said. I don't know exactly what that looks like yet, but I'm going to try. I looked at the apple tree, the lighter branches, the leaves beginning at the tips, the very first faint hint of the turn that would come in October. That's the whole thing, I said. That's all it is. He was quiet for a moment. I know, he said. I know that now. The call ended shortly after. No warmth yet, we were not there, not fully, and I was not going to pretend we were. But the distance between where we had been in January and where we were in September had a direction to it. A movement, slow and not guaranteed but present. That seemed like enough for September. I made the tea. I carried it to the table. I opened the green notebook to the page where I had written my one line beneath his last entry, and I read both lines together. His, then mine, the way you read a conversation between 2 people who have been talking for 36 years, and are still, in their own way, talking. She is going to be more than all right. You were right, Dad. You were right about all of it. I'm still showing up. I turned to the next blank page. I had been thinking, since the Saturday morning program in April, about something Vera had said in their first meeting. She had mentioned, almost as an aside, the way important things are often mentioned, almost as asides, by people who are too busy doing them to make speeches about them, that the program had no record of its history. 12 years of Saturday mornings, and no one had written it down. The planting schedules were there, his original ones alongside the updated versions. But the children, the Marcuses with their careful transplanting, the ones who had come through 8 years ago and gone on and were somewhere now, there was no record of them. Someone should write it down, Vera had said. Yes, I had said. I had been thinking about it since April. About the kind of writing down that serves as keeping, that holds a thing carefully in the way the green notebook held the Tuesday visits, not as evidence or archive, but as the record of a person who thought something was worth remembering and said so. I wrote at the top of the blank page, for the record. Then I began. Not a plan, not yet a plan. The first rough shape of something that might become one. A project that would take time and patience and the willingness to show up on Saturday mornings for as long as it required. The kind of project that is only possible when you are not telling everyone about it. When you are free from the particular erosion of other people's awareness of what you are doing. The way that awareness generates opinions and suggestions, and the gradual dilution of the original intention. My father had taught me this. He had taught me by example, which is the only teaching that actually holds. By the time the September light had gone entirely, and the garden was dark beyond the window and the tea was finished, and the first stars were doing their tentative September business above the roofline, I had written 3 pages. Not good pages, first pages never are, but true ones. The beginning of a record of 12 years of Saturday mornings, written by a woman who had been at precisely one of them and intended to attend the rest. I closed the notebook. I capped the pen. I sat in my father's chair in my father's kitchen in my father's house and looked at the dark garden. The apple tree, the rose canes, the maple at the front, invisible from here but present, always present, 34 years old and the most beautiful thing on the street. I thought about the document on my laptop. Things Dad taught me that I only understood later. 4 pages and growing. I thought about the planting schedule on the wall of the community center, his original sections preserved alongside the newer ones, his handwriting on the wall of a room full of children learning to grow things. I thought about the man at the far end of Birch Road, holding the bag of apples with both hands. A good man to wave to. I thought about Marcus, transplanting basil seedlings with his tongue at the corner of his mouth, looking up to ask, "Is that right?" "That's exactly right," I had said. It was all exactly right. The tending and the showing up and the quiet distribution and the records kept in the right place for the right person. All of it exactly right in the way of things that have been done with complete attention by someone who understood that the most important work is the work that continues after the worker is gone. He had understood that since 1987. Since the year he opened the account and planted the maple and drove through every red light between the office and the hospital and arrived, out of breath and entirely certain, to find that the thing he had been building toward had arrived. I stood up. I carried the mug to the sink. I rinsed it and set it on the rack, his sink, his window above it through which I had looked at this garden in every season now and would look at it in every season that came after. I turned off the kitchen light. I went to the hallway. I checked the lavender in the bowls, still good, another week in it at least. I put my hand into the left pocket of my coat, hanging on the second hook, and felt the shape of the brass key on its leather loop. I had started carrying it again, not for any practical reason. The safe it opened was empty now and in Mr. Osai's records. I carried it because it was warm from being carried, and because the leather was smooth from his hands, and mine both, and because some things you carry not because you need them, but because they are part of how you remember who you are and where you come from. I went upstairs. I stood at the bedroom window for a moment, the front bedroom, the one that faced the street, and looked at the maple in the September dark. You could not see much of it at this hour, only the shape of it against the slightly lighter sky, the mass of it, the particular silhouette of something that has grown for a very long time in the same place, and has become, through that persistence, exactly what it was always going to be. 34 years. It had been there before I was. It would be there after. I turned off the light. I went to bed. I slept the way I had been sleeping since the Friday of the will reading. Solidly, completely, the sleep of a person who has been given something real to tend and intends to tend it. In the morning, there would be the garden, the notebook, the Saturday program in 2 weeks, the document growing slowly toward something it had not yet fully revealed itself to be. In the morning, there would be Tuesday. I was going to show up. I had always been going to show up. My father had known it since before I did. Since the first Tuesday, I drove to his house and sat across the kitchen table from him and asked about a car sold in 1972 that he hadn't thought about in years. He had written it down that same evening. He had been certain ever since. October came back around. A full year of it now. The complete circle. Every season turned once. The garden having moved through its entire sequence from the January bear to the February first snowdrops to the April bud in my socks to the June roses to the September apples, and now back to the beginning again. The maple at the front doing what it did every October, the tips going first, the orange arriving at the crown and working downward, the tree changing into itself one branch at a time. I stood at the kitchen window on a Tuesday morning in the second week of October and watched it happen. The light through the window was the same light it had been a year ago, the low, particular amber light of an October morning in this part of the country that makes ordinary things look deliberate. The same light that had come through the kitchen window of the functional flat with the empty window boxes on every October morning of the 6 years I had lived there, and that I had looked at without quite understanding what I was looking at. I understood it now. It was the light of this house. The light this house produced every October at this hour, through this window. I had been living in it for a year without knowing it was mine, driving back to the functional flat in the evenings, carrying the key that had been my father's and would eventually be something I gave to someone else in the same way things are given when they are given with full intention. That time was not now. The time was October. The light was exactly what it was supposed to be. I made the tea. I carried it to the table. I sat in his chair. These were not decisions anymore. They were the settled rhythms of a person who has been somewhere long enough for the body to know where it belongs before the mind has fully woken up. The particular belonging that is not claimed, but simply true. On the table beside the mug was the green notebook. Beside it, something new, a different notebook, larger, its cover a deep blue, filled now from the first page to within 20 pages of the last with the record I had been writing since September. The history of 12 years of Saturday mornings. The children, named and described, the ones Vera remembered, and the ones the sign-in sheets recorded, and the ones whose specific details lived in the accumulated memory of a room that had held them every Saturday for a decade. The planting schedules, annotated with what had worked and what hadn't. His original sections, transcribed exactly, his handwriting preserved in mine. I had given it to Vera 3 weeks ago, a copy, properly bound, printed and covered. She had held it for a long time before she said anything. He would have liked this, she said. I think he would have done it himself eventually, I said. He was building toward it. He just ran out of Saturdays. Vera looked at the cover, then at me. You have his Saturdays now, she said. I had been thinking about that sentence since she said it, turning it over the way I turned things over now, with the full, unhurried attention he had taught me, the attention that does not rush toward a conclusion but lets understanding arrive in its own time. You have his Saturdays now. Not as inheritance, not in the legal sense, the sense of the green folder and the third account and the brass key. In the other sense. The sense in which the things that matter most are transferred not through documents, but through presence, through the specific texture of Tuesday and Thursday and Saturday accumulated over years, until the person doing the accumulating has become, without quite deciding to, the continuation of something that was always going to need continuing. He had known this was what was happening. He had written it down. I opened the green notebook to the conversation. His last entry, my one line beneath it. I read them both. Then I turned to the next blank page and I wrote the date at the top, the way he had always written the date, and underneath it I wrote the entry I had been composing since the morning the apple tree delivered, and the man at the far end of Birch Road held the bag with both hands and said a good man to wave to. October, the maple has turned again. I watched it from the kitchen window this morning, the orange arriving at the crown the way it does, the tree becoming itself from the outside in. I have been here a full year now. I understand something I did not understand in January. He was not building the account or the house or the investment or the case against Callum. Those were the form of it. What he was actually building was a person who knew how to show up. He was building me, from the first Tuesday I came and the first Thursday I sat across the table from him, and the first Saturday I stayed longer than I had planned. He was building me the way he built everything, quietly, without announcing it, tending the thing carefully and letting it find its own size. I am the thing he built. So is the maple. So is the climber on the south wall. So is the Saturday program and the record of it and the bags of apples left without notes on 8 doorsteps every September. He is still here. He is in everything he tended. I understand this now. I'm going to keep showing up. I closed the notebook. I set the pen down. I picked up the mug and held it with both hands the way you hold something warm when the morning is cold and the warmth is good and you want to be fully present to it. Outside, the maple was doing its October work. Patient. Certain. Becoming what it always became at this time of year, as it had every October for 34 years, as it would next October and the October after that, as long as the house stood and someone was at the window to watch it. I was at the window. I intended to keep being at the window. The lawyer called at 7:43 in the morning. That is how this story began. I told you that at the start because I needed you to know it first, that the call came, that I answered it, that what Mr. Osei said in his measured voice in the quiet of that January morning was the beginning of something rather than the end. I have been telling you, across everything that followed, what it was the beginning of. Not the money, though the money is real, and the security it provides is real, and I do not pretend otherwise. Not the house, though the house is mine now in the fullest sense, the sense that goes beyond legal title into the felt certainty of a place that has been waiting for you and has finally been told you have arrived. Not even the garden, though the garden is perhaps the closest thing, the garden that he tended for 34 years and left in the condition of something ready to be continued, its systems intact, its schedules written down, its varieties labeled in the right place for the right person to find. What the call at 7:43 in the morning was the beginning of was the full understanding of what my father had been doing on all those Tuesday and Thursday mornings, when I sat across the kitchen table from him and sorted the medications and reviewed the bills and asked about the photograph of the 22-year-old in the bedside drawer. He had been giving me himself, all of it, the precision and the patience and the practice of doing things correctly regardless of audience, and the specific quality of attention he brought to everything he loved. He had been giving it to me the way you give things to people who show up, not as a transaction, not as a reward, but as the natural transfer that happens between two people when one of them pays full attention to the other for long enough. I had been paying attention. He had noticed. He had been writing it down. On a Saturday morning in October, I drove to the community center for the autumn session of the Saturday program. The room was full, 17 children this year, 3 more than the spring, word having traveled in the way that good things travel in communities that are paying attention to each other. New faces alongside the returning ones showing the new ones where the trowels were kept, and how the sign-in sheet worked with the particular authority of children who have been somewhere long enough to know how it runs. Marcus was there. He was 9 now, a year of Saturday mornings older. His confidence with the trays and the soil settled into something more natural than last spring's careful concentration. He was showing a new girl, 7, small, with a look of tremendous seriousness, how to transplant a seedling without disturbing the root ball. Like this, he said, gentle, don't rush it. The girl nodded. She tried. The seedling went into the pot slightly crooked. She frowned. Try again, Marcus said. Not unkindly, with the specific patience of someone who has been shown something correctly and understands that showing it correctly to someone else is part of the process. She tried again. The seedling went in straight. She looked at it. "Is that right?" she said. Marcus looked at the pot. He looked at the seedling, upright, settled, the soil firm around its base. "That's exactly right," he said. I stood at the edge of the room and watched this, and felt something that I did not try to name immediately, but let arrive in its own time, the way understanding arrives when you are not rushing it. It arrived. My father had sat across a kitchen table from a young woman on a Tuesday afternoon and shown her how to sort medications and review bills, and read a garden and tend a rose, and carry a thing carefully from one place to another without disturbing what was essential. He had shown her with patience, and with the specific quality of attention that conveys not just the skill, but the value of the skill. Why it matters to do it correctly. Why doing it correctly regardless of audience is the whole point. And now she was here, at the edge of a room, watching a 9-year-old show a 7-year-old how to transplant a seedling without disturbing the root ball. "Gentle," Marcus said, "don't rush it." He had never met my father. He did not know about the kitchen table, or the Thursday afternoons, or the account begun in 1987, or the maple, or the notebook with its careful dated entries. He knew only what Vera had taught him on the Saturday mornings, which was what the planting schedule had taught Vera, which was what my father had written on the first Saturday morning 12 years ago when he sat down and put his 30 years of growing things into a document that other people could use. He was still here, in the room, in the seedling going into the pot straight on the second try, in the 9-year-old's patience with the 7-year-old's first attempt. He was in everything he attended. He had known it would work this way. That was why he had funded it. That was why he had come to check on the beds, saying he was just passing, watching the thing he loved grow in the specific and satisfied way of a person who understands that the point of tending something is not the tending, but what the tending makes possible afterward. I drove home from the Saturday program through October streets, the leaves coming down now, not dramatically, one and then another and then another, the trees letting go of what they no longer needed, getting lighter by degrees, preparing for the long, quiet season that makes the next spring possible. The same October streets I had driven a year ago in January darkness, with the cold coffee on my kitchen table, and the brass key in my palm, and 11 hours of grief behind me, and the lawyer's call 11 hours before that at 7:43 in the morning. The same streets, entirely different light. I parked in front of the house. I sat in the car for a moment looking at the maple, fully turned now, the orange complete from crown to root, the whole tree committed to the season, the light of the October afternoon moving through its leaves and making them luminous, the particular luminousness of things at the height of what they are before the letting go begins. 34 years old. Taller than the house. The most beautiful thing on the street. I got out of the car. I walked up the path. I let myself in with the key, the ordinary key, the front door key, not the brass one on the leather loop, though I had that too, in my jacket pocket, warm from being carried. I hung up my coat on the second hook. I went to the kitchen. I put the kettle on. I stood at the window above the sink while it heated and looked at the garden, the rose canes, the apple tree relieved of its fruit, the beds going dormant for winter in the correct sequence that his schedule had described and that I now knew by heart. By heart. The kettle boiled. I made the tea. I carried it to the table and sat in his chair and looked at the two notebooks side by side, the green one, his and now mine, the conversation continuing across the blank pages he had left after the last entry. The blue one, the record of 12 years of Saturday mornings, a copy of it now in a room on the wall of a community center where children came every week to learn how to tend things. I thought about the lawyer's call, 7:43 in the morning, his measured voice. "Miss Patton, I represent your father's estate." I thought about sitting in that office on the 3rd floor with the harbor photograph and the glass of water and the green folder on the plain desk, and the brass key between us, and the number on the single page that I had looked at for a long time. I thought about Gerald Patton at 22, standing in front of a car he would sell 6 months later, young and broke and already beginning. Already saving the first paycheck. Already understanding that the things worth having took time and consistency and the willingness to tend something long before it was large enough to notice. 36 years of Tuesday mornings and Thursday afternoons and Saturday visits to a garden program 2 streets away, saying he was just passing. 36 years of quiet, patient, unwavering building toward a morning he would not be present for a January morning when a lawyer called at 7:43 and said there were matters to discuss, and a woman who had been showing up for years said yes. She would come and put the phone down and looked at the brass key on the table and understood that whatever came next was what her father had intended. This was what he had intended. This kitchen, this chair, this window and this garden and this October light moving through the maple's leaves and these 2 notebooks on this table, and the seedling going into the pot straight on the second try, and the man at the far end of Birch Road holding the bag of apples with both hands. This was what 36 years of quiet building looked like when it was finished. It looked like a woman at a kitchen table on a Saturday afternoon in October, drinking tea in her father's chair, in her father's house, in the light her father had looked at every morning for 34 years and considered worth the staying. I picked up the green notebook. I opened it to the entry I had written that morning. I read it once, his last entry, my response, the October entry below. 3 voices on 3 pages, or 2 voices, or 1 voice in different registers at different points in the same long conversation that had begun on a Tuesday afternoon when a young woman drove to her father's house and sat across the kitchen table and asked about a car sold in 1972 that he hadn't thought about in years. He had thought about it all evening after she left. He had written it down. I closed the notebook. I set it on the table beside the blue one. I set my hand flat on both covers for a moment, the green and the blue, the record of what he had built and the record of what it had made possible, his handwriting and mine, the conversation continuing. Then I stood up. I rinsed the mug at the sink. I dried it with the dish towel on the oven handle and set it on the rack. I went to the hallway and checked the lavender in the bowl, fresh. I had replaced it last week from the garden, the last cutting of the season before the first frost came and took the rest. I put my hand in my jacket pocket on the second hook, the brass key on its leather loop, smooth and warm. I held it for a moment. Then I put my jacket on. I opened the front door. The October afternoon received me, the air sharp and clean, the light going golden at the edges, the maple at full color in the front yard, its leaves moving in the small wind that came up from the street, each leaf catching the light and releasing it in the particular way of things that are briefly, vividly, completely themselves before the letting go. I stood on the porch for a moment. My father had stood on this porch for 34 years. He had watched the maple from here in every October, the same tree at different stages of its 34-year life, and he had found it. I knew this from the notebook, from a July entry 5 years ago that had mentioned it in passing the way he mentioned the things he loved, briefly and without ornamentation. He had found it every October, entirely worth watching. I found it worth watching. I intended to keep finding it worth watching for as long as the tree stood, and the house stood and October came back around, which it would, which it always would. I stepped off the porch. I walked down the path. I stopped at the maple and put my hand on its trunk, the bark rough and certain under my palm, the tree solid in the way of things that have been growing in the same place for a very long time and have put down roots proportional to their height. Roots you cannot see, doing their quiet work underground, making the height possible. He had known this about trees. He had known it about people, too. I stood at the maple for a moment. The October light moved through the leaves above me, orange and gold, and the occasional deep red of a leaf that has committed fully to the season. A car passed on the street, a child on a bicycle, the ordinary, unremarkable Saturday afternoon business of a street where people live and come and go, and occasionally stand at their maples in October and remember who planted them and why. I am 37 years old. My father planted this tree the year he moved in, before I was born, before he knew who any of us would turn out to be. He planted it because he intended to stay, because he understood that the things worth having required time and consistency and the willingness to be present long before the results were visible. He stayed for 34 years. The tree is still here. I am still here. I am going to keep showing up. He was certain of this long before I was, from the first Tuesday, from the first Thursday, from the first time I sat across his kitchen table and asked about something nobody else had thought to ask about. He was certain of it the way he was certain of the maple, not with hope exactly, though there was hope in it too, but with the deeper certainty of a person who has been paying attention for a long time and knows what they have seen. He saw me. He wrote it down. He left the right things in the right places for the right person to find. And I found them. And I am still here. I took my hand from the bark. I looked up at the maple one more time, the full October color of it, the light through the leaves, the 34 years of it standing here doing exactly what it was planted to do. There it is, I thought. In his voice. With his particular mix of satisfaction and understatement. There it is. If this story has reached you, if anywhere in the last 10 parts you have recognized a kitchen table, a Tuesday morning, a person who showed up quietly and asked about you rather than about what you had, leave me a comment. Tell me their name. Tell me one thing they built for you in silence that you only understood later. I read every single one. I carry them with me into every story I tell. And if you want another story, about a woman who finds a set of letters in a house she is clearing, letters written over 40 years to a person she has never heard of, that change everything she thought she knew about where she came from, it is waiting for you. The link is in the description below. It begins with a name she doesn't recognize written in her mother's handwriting. Come with me.